all those who've been successful in entering the building.
Yeah. Is it difficult to get in?
Well, when there's a large number of people coming at the same time, yes, it has to be a bit slower. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would take your seats. Thank you very much for being here for this Global Forum on Competition from the OECD. We are very fortunate today that the Secretary General of OECD, Mr. Cormann, is going to address us. And I know that he has a very tight schedule, so I don't want to delay the proceedings. And I would like to welcome him on behalf of all of you and give him the floor.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm welcome, Monsieur Jenny, distinguished guests, ambassadors, colleagues, a very warm welcome to this 2023 edition of the OECD Global Forum on Competition. For the past 22 years, this forum has been an invaluable platform for competition agencies and policymakers to share experiences on investigations and competition advocacy, including the tools and strategies that have proven to be most effective, to build knowledge about OECD standards and tools for competition policy, our recommendations, our resources, such as the competition assessment toolkit, and also our research on emerging issues, to increase the level of alignment with best practices and also to engage in mutual learning through peer reviews of competition policy frameworks, to identify opportunities for closer cooperation, including through better information sharing and investigative coordination. And of course, perhaps most important of all, to engage in frank dialogue after hearing from the experts on emerging competition law challenges, such as those related to this period of comparatively elevated inflation or to misconduct in digital markets. Vibrant competitive markets are essential for getting growth back on track in our current challenging and disrupted economic environment. And I know that there will not be anyone in this room that disagrees with me on that statement. The OECD's latest economic outlook, which Clare and I released last week, projects a mild slowdown in the global economy. Inflation has come down, and the rate of global growth in the first 6 months of this year was close to the pre-pandemic average. However, in line with, I guess, what is entirely expected and indeed is the intended effect of monetary policy tightening, indicators of output growth have weakened since May, and investment has fallen in interest rate sensitive sectors like housing. We now project global GDP to grow at a rate of 2.9% this year, followed by a mild slowdown to 2.7% next year and a slight improvement to 3% in 2025. Which, in terms of global growth, compared to historical standards, is actually rather low global growth for the entire period to 25. To help optimize the strength of the recovery and indeed economic development and growth momentum over the medium to longer term, effective competition policy has, and as you all well know, has a key role to play. Ensuring competitive prices and quality for consumers, boosting productivity by ensuring firms have the incentives to be as efficient as possible, keeping markets open for innovation and improved products and services, including and in particular from small and medium-sized businesses, and ultimately spurring the economic dynamism we need for economic growth. Our analysis shows that in addition to encouraging stronger economic growth, effective competition actually also contributes to improving the quality of that growth. By tackling business conduct or regulations that create barriers to entry for new businesses, competition policy keeps markets open for entrepreneurs. I mean, that much we know, but competition policy can also support a more equitable distribution of wealth by enhancing opportunities, keeping prices low for consumers, and preventing the accumulation of durable market power. Our analysis of 8 member countries' finds that lower concentration of market power is associated with higher disposable income in the poorest 20% of households. Relatively new OECD work has also shown how competition policy can play a role in enhancing gender equality by tackling barriers to entry that preserve the status quo in markets historically dominated by informal male networks and male entrepreneurs. However, competition agencies need to ensure their analytical tools, including the definition of the relevant market, avoid gender blind spots to deliver their full benefits. And the OECD's new gender-inclusive competition toolkit, which will be launched this evening, provides some practical guidance in this regard. Going forward, to optimize these benefits, we need competition policy to deliver on three key objectives. First, supporting a global level playing field in the wake of changing patterns of trade and increased pressure on the international trading system. Our analysis finds that extensive use of market distorting subsidies in sectors ranging from agriculture to steel is undermining the proper and effective functioning of markets, reducing trust in the global trading system. Growing interest in industrial policy as a tool for policymakers to boost growth, address supply chain vulnerabilities, and to optimize the gains from the green and digital transformations carries with it the increased risk of market distorting subsidies if policy frameworks are not well designed. Our recommendation on competitive neutrality provides guidance on designing government support measures and policies, including industrial policy, to avoid those counterproductive distortions in markets and to maintain, to the greatest extent possible, a level playing field. We have also released a voluntary set of best practices for disclosure by internationally active state-owned enterprises to help build trust and encourage the application of competitive neutrality principles. Second, reducing regulatory barriers to competition and supporting well-functioning labor markets to enhance productivity and equality of opportunity. Over the past 2 decades, though, productivity growth has slowed across OECD economies from 2% in the early 2000s to less than 1% before the pandemic hit. One key tool for addressing this slowdown is removing regulatory barriers to competition, which can insulate incumbents from the pressure of new entries and even enable collusion on prices. The OECD has a set of resources, including our competition assessment toolkit, to help identify these regulatory barriers to competition and pro-competition alternatives. Our recent work has also looked at opportunities to improve the functioning of labor markets through regulatory reform. A labor market concentration where few employers compete for workers leads to lower employment and wages than in competitive labor markets. Recent OECD analysis finds that the 10% of workers who are employed in the most concentrated labor markets experience a wage penalty of at least 5%. Addressing these impacts could require restrictions on the use of non-compete agreements and active enforcement against collusive agreements between employers that seek to avoid competing for workers and to keep wages down. Third, ensuring competition law enforcement frameworks are effective and agencies have the resources needed to implement them. And again, I'm sure that there is broad agreement on this point across this room this morning. But this includes responding to the unique challenges in digital markets, such as signs of durable market power and new forms of misconduct. Jurisdictions are each taking their own approach to addressing these concerns through a mix of established competition enforcement tools, new agency enforcement tools, and new broader regulatory frameworks. To support peer learning and dialogue among jurisdictions on what measures work well, we have prepared an inventory of proposed or enacted legislative reforms to address digital competition issues across the G7 at the request of G7 countries. In closing, competition policy can and does make a powerful contribution to growth and the quality of that growth. To optimize that contribution, agencies will need to take on new challenges as patterns of global trade and economic activity evolve, challenges that will require us to continue to learn from experience and to adapt, like by tackling issues around digital competition concerns or incorporating sustainability into competition law assessments. Peer learning, open and frank dialogue on developing issues is very much at the core of what we are and what we do as an organization. It's one of the core purposes of this forum. So with those few opening remarks, my very best wishes for positive and productive and very candid discussions today and tomorrow that will help to take us forward in the spirit of better policies for better lives. And so thank you very much again, Chair, for having given me the opportunity to say a few words, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. And a number of the themes that you have talked about are very close to what has been done in the Competition Committee is going to be done. Certainly on industrial policy, on the inventory of initiative in the digital sector. And we have spent quite a bit of time looking at the implications for competition law and policy of the transformation brought by the digital in many aspect, and we're continuing doing it, particularly with respect now to artificial intelligence, which creates even newer challenges. So we're very much aligned with the objectives that you have talked about, and very thankful that you came and opened all proceedings. So thank you very much for being with us. Let me now turn the floor to Mr. Noia.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mathias, for your encouraging opening remarks. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you today as Director for Financial Enterprise Affairs here at the OECD. You have just heard from our Secretary General about how competition contributes to strong and high quality economic growth and better policies for better lives. I'm proud that actually the OECD work on competition is one of the cornerstone of the multiple policy areas and subjects topics of my directorate, which is commonly referred as DAF, with many synergies with the other directorates and the chief economist and ECO. Now, you are all familiar here of our work with our work on competition policy, but maybe you may know, or you may less, or you may like to know more about the wealth of knowledge and expertise otherwise produced by DAF that actually could support your work and where also your work feeds into. Competition is not an isolated policy topic. It's a dynamic thread woven into the fabric of economic progress, innovation, and societal well-being. Now, DAF responsibilities also encompass financial markets, anti-corruption, among others, investment, and responsible business conduct. So competition serves as a catalyst that reverberates across all these areas. So driving positive change and fostering robust, inclusive growth. And as Aristotle said, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, let me illustrate with 3 examples the profound linkages and the synergies between competition and the other policy areas under DAF's care. Firstly, with our capital markets and financial institution division. So competition actually is an engine for robust financial markets. Actually, only last week I had the pleasure to attend a seminar on competition and financial markets hosted by the Brazilian Institute of Teaching, Development and Research with Justice Mendes, with actually Alexandre Cordeiro, the chair of the Brazilian Competition Commission and also the chair of the Securities Commission. And this is interesting because, competition in financial markets is very important. At the same time, we were discussing just before that actually New York Stock Exchange was NYSE was created with a so-called Buttonwood Agreement, which you may today evaluate it as a typically anti-competitive measure because all broker-dealers, they met under this Buttonwood. They decided to concentrate all the liquidities, all the trading among themselves, and also fixing prices. But at the same time, the concentration of trades and all the supply and demand gives a lot of liquidity and maybe better prices. And the evolution we discussed in the seminar of the exchange industry. You have, for example, in Europe, but also now in South America, some networks of exchanges, and then some more isolated ones. So it's competition is important, fuels innovation, serves also as a more broadly as a safeguard for consumer choices in banking, insurance, and capital markets. And so a competitive landscape induces institutions to innovate and deliver superior financial services and ensures that they meet diverse consumer needs, such as by providing accessible finance, for example, to women entrepreneurs, and a well-enforced competition law that you are doing and can guarantee fair access to financial services for all consumers, irrespective of background or identity. Coming back also to other aspects of still in the example of financial markets, of fintech, which we have discussed actually in the competition committee, you have discussed very actively, including development in financial markets and their potential impact on competition. This is a key issue. Forthcoming actually OECD analysis from our financial markets expert deep dives into recent advances of generative AI, generative artificial intelligence in finance, and actually raises potential competition issues related to model development, like large language models such as ChatGPT. Given the enormous amounts of compute power and data required to develop and train generative AI models, activity could end up concentrated in a few dominant players, particularly those with a first-mover advantage or with the resources available to undertake design, training, and maintenance of models. So financial market participants dependent on dominant third parties for their models could face the consequences of lack of competition, which could then be passed on to their customers. So in terms, obviously, of associated cost. And this leads me also to the work still in the first example on consumer protection. Actually, some of you, your authorities are mandated to enforce. Now, financial education of consumers is inseparable from fostering a competitive marketplace, empowering them to make informed decisions in a competitive landscape. An educated consumer base is essential for markets to function efficiently, as it encourages competition by enabling individuals to understand and compare financial products and services effectively. And this ultimately contributes to companies striving to offer superior products and services to meet consumer informed preferences. Also, Secretary General, another area mentioned all the topic of competitive neutrality for SOEs, for example. This is another area of synergies. But also, it's interesting to conclude this first example that sometimes financial market regulation unintendedly may create or strengthen oligopolies or monopoly, especially when moving under, let's say, public supervision. Some industries with few players, imagine credit rating agencies or even audit firms, or now the most recent one, proxy advisors, trade repositories. And this is also something maybe sometimes a bit not so intuitive in the consequences. Now, so there are many synergies with capital markets, and this leads me quickly to the second example, the synergies between competition and the work, for example, on anti-corruption. Competition policies and anti-corruption measures are actually mutually reinforcing, forming a symbiotic shield against corrupt practices and ensuring markets function. Together, they can ensure fairness and combat corruption's grip, for example, by deterring bid rigging in public contracts. Simultaneously, competition and anti-corruption dismantle market barriers, promoting equitable access and hindering favoritism. Another interesting fact to note is that the work undertaken by the Working Group on Bribery and our Anti-Corruption Division to apply a gender lens to foreign bribery actually provided important insights that contributed to the development of the new gender-inclusive competition toolkit that the Secretary General referred to. And the third and last, very quickly in the interest of time, example for horizontal effects between competition and other DAF policy areas is our work on investment. Foreign investment thrives when competition policy is in place to ensure a level playing field and predictable business environment. And in fact, competition is one of the policy areas that are examined as part of our policy framework for investment for our investment policy reviews. These reviews provide a comprehensive and systematic approach for improving investment conditions in a jurisdiction under review. These three examples out of many for the interconnectedness of competition with other DAF work streams underscore the multifaceted impact of competition policies on our broader societal goals. Our collective commitment to nurturing competitive markets is not just a matter of economic policy. It is a fundamental pillar for creating inclusive societies, empowering consumers, and driving sustainable development. So I now have the honor to hand the floor over to Clare Lombardelli, the OECD Chief Economist. I think it's the first time, so you address the Global Forum on Competition. The Chief Economist, Clare, holds a pivotal role at the OECD, spearheading our in-depth economic analysis and crafting policy directives and reports, such as, and it was mentioned by Secretary General, the recent also OECD Economic Outlook, as well as the economic surveys of individual countries. So for us, for me, it's really a great honor to have you here today, Clare. And so I wish you, now I conclude, I wish you a successful forum and hope to see many of you again at our Competition Open Day in March 2024. Thank you, and Clare, the floor is yours.
Morning all. Thank you very much to Frédéric and Carmine for inviting me to participate in your forum, and thank you for your kind words, Carmine. And of course, I should thank Lynn and the team for the organisation of this committee, this forum. Looking at the scale of it, I can imagine that is no small task. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm a passionate believer in the importance of competition and its value. If you spend your life working in economics, you can't help but see the importance. Competition is a core part and driver of productivity growth, and productivity is obviously and clearly the only sustainable way to improve people's standards of living. So absolutely critical. And if you were to look at our surveys of the individual countries that we do at the OECD, as Carmine mentioned them, the frequency with which particular recommendations around competition appear in those surveys is really high, and that's because we see it as a key lever to help improve those economies and raise the standards of living of the people that live in them. So look, I think I don't need to elaborate today on the fundamental role that competition plays in ensuring the efficient functioning of markets, of driving innovation, reducing prices, fostering economic growth. You've heard about that already in some of the opening comments, and it will be core to your DNA in what you do. So what I was going to talk about instead is a sort of new, a noteworthy trend in policymaking that impacts directly on competition, and that is the resurgence in the use of industrial policy. It's an important context, I think, for your discussions you're having today and tomorrow, including this morning. You're going to talk about globalization and regionalization. So industrial policies have a long history. They gained a popularity in the aftermath of the Second World War, but then they sort of declined in advanced economies, at least in the mid-60s. I mean, countries continued to use them in practice, but in a much more sort of low-key fashion. Obviously, in emerging markets, we've seen greater use over this period, but certainly industrial policy, it had its heyday straight after the Second World War, and then declined a bit. Of course, in recent years, a combination of global challenges have rekindled an interest in industrial policy, and that includes things like the discontent we see some people feeling with globalization, the imperative to address climate change, and the heightened awareness of risks stemming from higher economic interdependency following, we saw in COVID-19, and increasing geopolitical tensions have led lots of countries to sort of question and think about this again. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about industrial policy? I mean, there isn't a universally accepted definition of the term. We can broadly consider it to be government policies that are aimed at delivering structural changes in an economy to address market failures resulting from positive or negative externalities. So if you consider, for example, the climate transition, the underinvestment in innovation and technological change requires government intervention to align private incentives with social returns. If government If governments don't act, not enough will happen to try and address climate change. A similar case can be made for economic resilience or for regional development, for example. So improving general business conditions is not sufficient to induce the sectoral structural changes that we need. Industrial policies mostly consist of interventions at reallocating resources towards selective industries, technologies, or geographical areas. They don't just do that, and sometimes they're broader, but that is generally one of the things that they try to do. However, challenges obviously arise when policymakers and sometimes politicians are tasked with picking winners in the absence of market forces. So the potential trade-offs with competition are especially evident, I think, when you think about interventions that have a narrow focus or are directed at, say, specific firms or very narrow sectors. The more targeted the interventions that you have, the higher the risk that competitive distortions might then be introduced and might lead to inefficiencies. So considering from an international perspective, the challenges might be even greater. It's true that industrial policies introduced in one country can yield positive spillovers for other countries. You know, we will hopefully particularly see that for climate and the cost of climate technology. But, you know, so technological advancements, benefits from greenhouse gas emission reductions are a good example of that. However, they can also have negative consequences. So if one country implements industrial policies to produce its domestic production capacity in a sector, governments in other countries might be encouraged to implement countervailing measures due to the fear that they lose productive activities, investment, or employment in their countries. And this is a debate we're seeing now. If more countries were to simultaneously adopt similar policies in support of the same sector, what this would cause is overcapacity, losses in economies of scale, and then inefficient duplication of fixed costs. So ultimately, we'd see higher prices for everyone. Amid the current wave of interventions for national security and domestic production goals, there is a need for sort of careful consideration of these trade-offs. Limiting foreign trade exposures through industrial policy risks a subsidy race that will not only be costly and ineffective, but it could lead to inefficient resource allocation, reduce competitive pressures. It could trigger sort of tit-for-tat reactions, escalating protectionism, slowing down structural adjustments, and undermining the international trading system that has benefited so many people around the world. So how can industrial policies be reconciled with preserving competition? I mean, certainly not all market failures should be addressed through industrial policy. Efficiency and effectiveness assessments, along with cost-benefit considerations relative to alternative measures, can guide our interventions, and competition authorities can play a crucial role in providing advice on how to minimize market distortions. Secondly, given the uncertainty surrounding the effects of industrial policies and the limited public resources, government intervention should focus on sectors with substantial social, economic, or environmental externalities and where costs are manageable. That creates a bit of a trade-off, as I said, where you're targeting your efforts. That can lead to issues around competition, but equally we're saying you do need to focus on where you would target those efforts to have the biggest impact on the objectives you're trying to achieve. Obviously, competition advocacy can help highlight the risks and help direct industrial policy effectively. And lastly, competition policy and industrial policy should be viewed as complementary. So each plays a distinct role. While industrial policy should ensure structural changes that address important market failures, competition policy should guarantee a healthy competitive environment, preventing anti-competitive practices, avoiding excessive market concentration through mergers, and encouraging innovation and economic efficiency. So look, let me conclude. In sort of industrial policy is back in a sense. It's getting them right that is the challenge. It's a challenge to which the competition community, you can all contribute. Achieving that balance between industrial and competitive policies is crucial for addressing market failures, but also crucial for minimizing the distortions that could come with those failures or the ways in which we address them. We need to navigate this very complicated landscape. We need to navigate it carefully and keeping in mind what our overall goal is here, which is fostering economic growth, but also fair competition. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lombardelli, for this very interesting, and also Mr. Noia, together with Mr. Cormann, for those very interesting introduction to our work. Just two rapid comments, and maybe if you allow me a couple of questions. Rapid comments the OECD is really a place that allows specialists of one dimension of competition policy to enter into discussion with other specialists. And it's quite noticeable in the competition community that it's, in a sense, easier to put competition together with other policy in the context of OECD than sometimes it is to do it at home. So this is a really important part. We've had, and we keep having numerous joint committee or work together with other committees. And I think that this is a really important thing, and it can give ideas to countries about what to do at home domestically. On the issue of industrial policy, what we heard with great interest what you said, for one reason in particular, which is the fact that we do have already in our program of work for June of next year, a session on how to conceive of a pro-competitive industrial policy. And I wanted to say from that point of view that as we see it, there has been a lack of attention on the part of the competition community to industrial policy over the last 20 years. It was a bad name in some ways because there had been a type of industrial policy which is disregarded, in fact, the competition incentives that you talked about. But at this point, the issue is not only to maintain competition in face of industrial policy, it is to try to help think about how industrial policy could be pro-competitive, how it could itself be a way to try to face the different cases where industrial policy is needed, whether there is a coordination problem, whether there is an externality problem, or sometimes when markets don't work fast enough for achieving a social result. But at the same time, doing it in a way which is going to use the incentives that are going to be freed by competition. I think there are questions about how to conceive the instrument of industrial policy, and also a lot of questions about the procedures of industrial policy, which can help bridge the gap between what could be antagonistic policies, but are really complementary policies. So we are going modestly to try to bring some ideas there on how to change the relationship between competition policy and industrial policy. Now, I have two questions for you. One of them, you started by saying that productivity is the key issue for economic development, which we all tend to agree to. But as a competition community dealing a lot these days with all the changes that are due to the digital revolution, we have two sets of questions. One of them is, we have been told that one of the benefits of the digital revolution should be a tremendous increase in productivity. It's not entirely obvious when you look at productivity measures that anything has happened. And the digital revolution has started a little while ago. So there's a first mystery there as to why it doesn't show at the macroeconomic level, at least in statistics. And we have a similar question with respect to competition. How can we, and this is a very pragmatic issue for a lot of competition authorities. Their governments ask them, what do you do for the country? So it's one thing to say, well, I try to keep the incentives, and so that's a good thing, but it's a very abstract response. What they would like to have is statistics that would show that indeed in countries where there is a more active or more long-standing competition policy, productivity tends to be higher than in other countries. And because we believe that there's a relationship there, it's not always obvious to find it in statistics which are produced. So it may be because we don't know where the right statistics are, or it may be because there's a slight mystery. And I would like to ask you your standpoint on this.
Thank you very much. Those are two fantastic questions. So I'm sure you're all aware that the Robert Solow quote, it was 1987, he says, you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the statistics, and that I think we all can feel some affinity to. I'd say there's three things going on that are probably why we don't see the sort of advancements of technology in the productivity data. One will be about the data itself. It's just incredibly hard to measure these advancements in the traditional data that we use. You know, our colleagues in statistics authorities try incredibly hard, but you know, the obvious example people talk to is if you take Google Maps. Google Maps is free to us, as a user. I mean, it's not free, but it's free to us as a user. So it's not in the GDP statistics, but it has completely transformed the way in which people get around. I'm sure many people used it this morning to find the location here. So we don't price it. And at the, you know, one of the ways in which we do estimate productivity, GDP and the like is through the pricing of goods. So, you know, there is, to some extent, we are having to change the way in which we measure these things. So there is something going on where the statistics are struggling to keep up with technological developments. Another issue I think that is a challenge is to reap the full benefits of these technological advances. You do need complementary investment, particularly intangible investment. So, you know, people need the skills to be able to use them is the obvious example. And some people have those skills and some people don't. But we haven't, in countries, we don't invest enough in those skills, and we haven't got the distribution of those skills quite right. So there's more we need to do to take full advantage of the technology. And then the third thing, which I think is particularly relevant to people that work in competition and where you know you can all help with, is around the process of diffusion. So you know, the world is developing technologies incredibly quickly, but we are less good at diffusing those across economies and sort of using them in our work. And there's sort of an interesting question as to why we are seeing a decline in the share of sort of high growth and innovative firms in our economies. Now, why is that? Is it because these technologies have kind of extensive, as Carmine mentioned, network effects, big winner take all type products, particularly if you think about, you know, AI but other digital technologies? Is that, you know, making it harder for competition there? You know, is it making it harder for smaller firms to attract the resources they need to get over these hurdles? So those would be the three things that I would point to. I'm sure there are many others. On the question of competition, you know, we all say it's good, but is it really good? I would disagree with you slightly. I think you can see it in the data and in the evidence. And in fact, we've got lots of analysis and work that we've done here that shows you at both the macro and the micro level. You know, we know that economies that are more competitive have better macro outcomes. You know, they grow faster, they have higher productivity, they have lower inflation. Actually, we've got evidence and analysis that shows that, and the OECD has published some of that. The other thing I would say is also in the micro data, you can see it. And actually, this underpins the approach we take on our product market review indicators, where we look at every country and we assess product markets and how competitive in particular they are. And actually, if you look at firm level productivity, you know, more competitive firms and in more competitive environments, firm level productivity is higher. We also can see that the allocation of resources is better where there is competition. And we also have some evidence on spillover. So I think there is actually quite a lot of evidence that supports the case that competition, you know, is genuinely benefiting people. And we saw that recently with the inflation shock and the rise in the cost of living, actually. And you saw there, in particular, where countries were undertaking, for example, market studies, these had a real impact on pricing, where they could identify areas where countries needed to take action. So, you know, I think there is a lot of evidence there that competition is the right thing to pursue, and that's why, as I say, we promote it so much in our surveys and our advice to countries.
Thank you very much for saying that. I mean, we actually believe in this community that there is a link, and we affirm, and we have documents on the side of the OECD trying to use whatever statistics we have. You're absolutely right in saying that at the firm level, I mean, there's fairly consistent and evidence. Ministers, members of parliament always like to have macroeconomic data that are striking, and so they look for that kind of data. So that's where we have maybe to be more systematic in trying to research evidence that we can use for lobbying in favor of more competition policy and more competition law enforcement. I don't know if you have time for one or two other questions, but I would open the floor if anybody wants to ask question to Clare. You raise your flag high up so we can see that you raise your flag. I mean, following on what we said, one of the examples that comes to my mind is the fact that Australia, for example, which has had quite active competition policy for a number of years, has decided to review its competition policy because nevertheless its productivity has been falling. So the question is, how does one explain this? Was this that the competition policy was insufficient, or was it that something else got into the way, or that competition policy is not as directly linked to level of productivity? But this is the kind of mechanism that I was thinking about. Is there any request for the floor? Are you all eager to start discussing the intricacies of competition law and policies? There are no requests for the floor. Well, I would really want to thank very much Secretary General Cormann. And there is from Australia, as a matter of fact.
As you proposed it, President, I would like to make a brief comment and see how the chief economist sees this. I think the best summary we can give is that we have a number of very significantly already concentrated markets in key areas of infrastructure supporting the economy. And the third part of the answer the chief economist gave in relation to the digital economy and digital platforms, we have considered that our smaller and medium-sized enterprises have had difficulties being able to achieve the benefits, and also that significant parts of the benefits have been appropriated by the largest platforms in other jurisdictions and economies and not within Australia. And that is part of our reason for advocacy for reform in our own jurisdiction. But I did see a lot of value in those comments you were making. Thank you.
So that opens up possibility of fields for advocacy of competition authorities, particularly in the diffusion. I mean, what can we do to try to help this diffusion so that those new technologies will be implemented more easily, educational programs and things like this. So thank you very much for this. Japan? Oh yeah, sorry, Mariko, I couldn't see you.
I just put it up. Thank you very much. Since the chief economist there, I cannot refrain from asking a question about innovation. And I know OECD has a substantial section that tracks innovation and technology around the world. And one of the questions that the competition committee has been tackling is the relationship between competition and innovation, which is very complicated, as you know. And I wonder if you could tell us if there are any findings at the OECD about the relationship between competition and innovation, and if we were interested, where we could look among OECD's outputs to try to find the answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so on that, I mean, you're right, there's a complicated and unclear relationship between competition and innovation. What we do know, and this is in OECD analysis as well as external, and the directorate actually that do a lot of work in this is the Science and Technology and Innovation Directorate, and you know they have a lot of publications in this space as well. What we do know is innovation itself is becoming more concentrated, and it links a bit to this question about technology and technology advancement and this sort of winner-takes-all approach. But you're seeing increasingly innovation becoming more concentrated within economies. I mean, we're also seeing, you know, more, if you like, countries moving up the technology scale, and that obviously increases the amount of innovation overall. So you know, there is some work there. We should definitely provide that information and those links. And then the other thing I would just say in response to the comment from Australia, I mean, you know, completely agree. I mean, lots of things are going on. You know, if I'm an economist, I would say, so you never know the counterfactual, but there is clearly an issue around the impact of technology on competition. And I have to say that is why I think your work is absolutely critical, because if these markets continue as they will, we will end up with incredibly concentrated power, you know, because they require very high levels of investment, because owning data is incredibly valuable. It is the input of value for many of these firms, and many of these firms own this data. So really, you know, your work on how do you bring competition to those sorts of markets is absolutely critical. And I also would say the only solution to this will be an international one. And so, you know, this forum is absolutely critical as part of the international work, and the role of competition, I think, is absolutely critical, because, you know, without it, actually, we're looking at quite a challenging distribution. Thank you.
If I may add a comment on the question and the answer from Japan, one of the issues that we've been very interested in and actually investigating in the Competition Committee has been not only the relationship between competition and innovation, but how the dynamics of competition and innovation can be linked. And from that point of view, I want to mention the fact that, first of all, there seems to be a disconnect between competition economists and business school economists from that point of view, because the business school economists tend to look at the dynamics of innovation in firms, whereas the competition economists tend to have more static kind of black box approach. But a very important report has been produced in Japan on this, which was presented, in fact, by Reiko Aoki, the Japanese delegate, this week, outlining, I mean, it needs to be operationalized, but outlining very precisely different types of influence, which go in different direction, but trying to get a handle and to go past the Schumpeter versus Arrow kind of discussion, A, by being more dynamic, and B, by being more subtle in underlying the different forces and how they interact. So I mentioned this because I think that this could be a very useful way forward to understand better the dynamics of the relationship between competition and innovation. Thank you very much. There is a question from Mexico.
Thank you, Chair. Regarding this challenge that you just mentioned about competition in the digital area, and also when all this digital transformation that started like 10 years ago, when it starts, there are not enough resources, computing resources in order to manage all the data. Right now, they are the resources, they are the algorithms, and they are changing so many things as with the AA. Do you think that it is, or you have any insights there in OECD that realize or shows how right now it is a biggest challenge with the AA? Because we just 2 years ago, the industries asked for node to be regulated in order to continue the innovation. But 1 year ago, they go and ask for the regulators to have a special of regulation, of strict regulation, because the big companies have an auto-regulation or self-regulation, but the small ones, they do not have. And the one that they do not have, they are making things that they supposed not to be, and then they can sell to the big companies in order to have that kind of algorithms. So how are you wondering that we can manage that new challenge? Because it's not only the digitalization right now, it's the algorithms and it's the data available, or not solo the data available, but right now there are the resources in order to get instantaneous, almost instantaneous results in order to identify the customer, identify the demand, identify the offer. Thank you.
I mean, look, it's a great question, and we could talk all morning about AI and its the sort of risks and challenges. A couple of things I would say. So one is, I mean, look, AI is a phenomenal technology and is a fantastic positive opportunity as well as a risk for the world. You know, this will completely change the way in which we think about cognitive tasks, we undertake them, and the productivity with which we can do them, and that will free up huge amounts of resources for other things. And you know, that is a very good thing. It's technological advance. That said, as you say, it comes with a whole host of risks, and you raise a particular one about who owns algorithms and how small companies feed into larger companies and those sorts of issues. What I would say, I mean, that is a risk, and one of the many risks that come up for competition in the competition space around AI. There's a numbers of pieces of work actually the OECD is doing in this space that might interest you. So we are doing some work obviously in the sort of macroeconomic space about the overall impact of AI, looking at productivity, and it looks at some of the issues you say around inputs. So, you know, it's not just data that is an absolutely critical input that not everyone will have access to. The amount of energy that is needed just to do this computation is also quite extraordinary when you look at it. So these sorts of things will change the way in which we think about inputs to those sorts of processes. We're also undertaking and have done a lot of work around setting out principles for the safe use of AI, for regulation, and the OECD is doing a lot of work, particularly under the Hiroshima process that was announced last year in the G7. And so more work, you know, you can see quite a lot already put out by the OECD in the space of thinking about some of the regulatory approaches that we should take, and there's more to come in that space.
Noia?
Yeah, just very quickly, because we're running out of time. Simply, as I mentioned, actually also on the space of, this is linked also to the Japan question, innovation and the competition. We are about to publish this work on actual of generative AI in finance. Actually, we will also working with Financial Market Committee, host a workshop there. I mean, this is an important topic where you have different effects. On the one side, innovation, I would say in financial market area, it lowers, barriers, lowers costs, so increase, I would say, competition. But also on the other side, you have a lot of, due to network effects, first mover advantage, so raising, the barrier. So it's really very important. That's why also I think economic analysis data, as all of you are pushing for, is essential. But also we will also, Frédéric, inform you of all this, the work also across the house, which I think can be a good input. Thank you.
Thank you for this. The interest of this discussion is quite obvious. I don't want to abuse. I know that you have a very heavy schedule. I propose to take two questions, which are going to be together, the last questions, to let you answer, and then to close this. So Singapore is first, and I think it's Turkey. Yeah. So.
Yeah, mine is just a follow-up on the discussion on AI. I'm here. So just to be a bit clearer, when you talk about productivity, there is total factor productivity and labor productivity. We talk about AI, the impact of AI, and if free market competition determines that machine wins over human, and the competition is not creating human jobs, as the chief economist covering all policies, including labor policies, would you have an issue with that? And from a broader perspective, how should we look at this? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Turkey?
Well, my question will be about connection between competitiveness and competition policies. So there are many studies showing that there is a connection between growth and competitiveness, but is the connection between competition policies and competitiveness itself was empirically shown? Thank you.
Okay, let me take look on the second of those. I suspect others will have more detailed knowledge of the specific literature around competition policies, but I can tell you from the work that we do on surveys, when we go to countries and we recommend competition policies and they implement them, then when we follow up, you can see that there is sort of improvement as a result of that. And I think actually there's quite a rich literature around competition policies. Obviously, some are more effective than others, and it depends on the circumstances. But there is a lot of information and evidence out there that competition policies themselves do drive competition, as you'd expect. On sort of philosophical question about the impact of AI and what do you think? I mean, AI should improve total factor productivity and labour productivity. So, I mean, the big question for labour is to what extent is a substitute or a complement? And, you know, it's kind of too early to tell, but there's clearly both going on. And for some, you know, for some industries, clearly they will be substituted by AI ultimately. And that will be, you know, an issue and a challenge, and then that labour will need to reallocate, and that will happen over time, and it will differ across countries. But for a huge, you know, for the vast majority of the economy, AI will be a complement. You know, it makes it easier to do what you do. I'm sure many people in this room use it all the time and can see its transformative value. And there, actually, what it will do is it will add to labour productivity as well. So I'm not worrying that, you know, man is going to be replaced by machine. You know, I think there will be elements of that, and where we will see it, and we will see it in certain sectors, and you can see in certain sectors, actually, you know, medium and long term, those will be things done by computers in the way they used to be done by people. And we've seen that over time in the past as well. What you need there, and what is absolutely critical, and we advise, is, you know, countries need to have good policies to help people retrain, reskill, both to take advantage of AI, but also to move into other industries and sectors. And that is the critical thing, because, you know, the risk here is that the benefits of AI will not be felt evenly without intervention, both in those markets themselves, and that's where there's a role of competition, but also actually in the social welfare that countries will have to undertake in the way that it does in response to all technological change, you know, that changes our labour markets, and we will have to help and support people moving to new, better, more productive employment, where, you know, they will have higher labour productivity and therefore higher standards of living. But I don't believe in, like I say, this idea that we're all going to be redundant and there'll be nothing for us to do with our time, but we will have to undergo quite a transition, and providing the necessary support will be absolutely critical there to avoid social costs that would otherwise be quite high.
From that point of view, this is an approach that unfortunately was a bit lacking towards the end of the previous century and the beginning of the 20th century, and which led, in fact, to the populist reaction against globalization. It was not so much that competition or international trade were seen to be bad in themselves. It was the fact that they had distributive effect. Labor was not mobile, unlike what we assume. And as a result, a lot of people got stuck in situations where they were on the losing side and reacted very negatively. And there was possibly not enough complementary policies put into place or thought through, such as education mobility policies that could have eased the transition that was necessary for globalization to really deliver all the benefits. This has been a very interesting exchange. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you very much, Mr. Noia and Clare, for being with us and enlightening us on the macroeconomic dimension of competition law and policy, and the link with other policies at OECD. We're very keen to see that what we do is also of use for the rest of this institution. And we are now going to turn back to the micro level. But thank you very much for having been here. So we're going to interrupt for 5 minutes, and then we're going to have the first roundtable. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the speakers of the first roundtable to come to. Huh? Yeah. Thank you very much to all of you for taking your seats. And we are going to start with the first session of this Global Forum on Competition. Let me first just announce what the program is going to be. So the first session is entitled From Globalization to Regionalization, and I'm going to tell you in a minute what it is all about. This afternoon, we will have a more technical session, but a session which is of interest to a lot of competition authority around this room, alternatives to leniency program. And the idea there is that leniency programs are tremendously useful, at least in jurisdictions which have already established themselves as tough enforcers. But there may be a case that the effectiveness of leniency program wanes or decreases over time. And so what are the alternatives that one can have to try to make sure that there are enough uncovering of anti-competitive practices for the competition authorities to intervene? Tomorrow, Friday, there will be a discussion in the morning on the use of economic evidence in cartel cases, which is also something of interest to a lot of people around this room. And tomorrow afternoon, there will be a discussion of ex post assessment of merger remedies. So we've tried to have sessions which are very directly related to the work of competition authorities and to try to exchange good practices in various areas. This morning's session is a more general session, and the idea behind the session was to move away a little bit from, at least in the context of the OECD, which is the North Atlantic dialogue on competition between the US, Canada, Mexico on the one hand, and European and a few Asian countries, which has been very focused on digital issues and how you deal with those issues, and to try to see what has been happening in regions, in various regions. We understand that what led to the movement of globalization until the early 2000s has been replaced by a more regional set of approach, which have replaced the previous approach, which was very much influenced by globalization and by this tendency towards convergence of everybody. But since then, globalization, for various reasons that I'm not going to go into, are seen as not always as promising. And we have signs that at regional levels, there are initiatives which are being developed to try to push forward the agenda of competition. So what we want to do is to try to go to different regions and try to assess three things. What has been happening over the last 20 years? What have been the main developments and what do they mean? Second, is there the development of an understanding of the role of competition, whether we talk about the general public or we talk about policymakers? Do they have a better understanding of competition? Third, what are the challenges? What are the hot topics and what are the challenges? Because it may be that in other regions, the source of concern in terms of competition may be different from the ones that are traditionally expressed by OECD competition countries or those countries. So to try to get a view of this, we've also decided to take an external view, and that's why on the table you have experts, and there's one online. We have taken experts looking at the region, familiar with a particular region, to try to guess, to give us a perspective, their perspective on what were those developments, what are the issues, what are the challenges of competition law in their region. So let me go through the list of experts. To my right is Thomas Cheng, who's a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Francis Karaoke is online, so we will see him online. Angayar, Kanni, Ramaiah is next over there. And she's a senior lecturer at UiTM Penang in the Faculty of Law of the Universiti Teknologi Mara. Simon Roberts, who is next to Lynn Robertson, professor at the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg. Mario Umaña is over there, lead trade and competition specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. And Angela Cheng, who is associate professor of law and director of the Philip Wong Center for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong. For the purpose of this exercise to try to figure out what's taking place in the world, we have divided the world in 4 regions, and there is a little bit of arbitrariness in the way we've divided it, but try to keep it manageable. So we're going to look at Latin America, we're going to look at Africa, we're going to look at South Asia, and we're going to look at China. Now, I do realize that China is not a region in itself, but it is a region in some ways, some relevant ways. So it's interesting to know what are the developments and what are the main issues in China. So I'm going to ask our speakers to be brief, to speak no more than 5 minutes and 4 minutes if possible, because we started late because the introductory session was so interesting, and to try to be synthetic and address each one of the questions which I have mentioned. And if we are really pressed for time, maybe I'll put together the last 2, the hot topics and the challenges. But let's start by what have been the main developments of competition law and policy in the region over the past decade. And let's start with Africa. And I will first give the floor to Simon Roberts to lead that discussion. And then additional remarks will be given by, so you have to push the little button in the center. That's it. And Francis Karaoke will.
Thank you very much, Frédéric, and thanks for the invitation to come here. This is obviously very close to a topic very close to my heart and very timely. So I think, as you said in the introduction, we've been spending a lot of time talking about the importance of data for competition. But in many of the countries that we work with in the center, when you ask people about issues with data, they say, how much do I pay for that data? In other words, it's about competition regulation of mobile telecoms, which is the most important thing for them. In terms of the developments in Africa, first point is that this is incredibly diverse, as we all know, diverse in terms of countries, backgrounds, histories, and also in terms of competition. So it's very difficult to make generalizations. And we're very aware from the work we do in the center, which is across different areas of the continent, how patchy our understanding is. We have better understanding in some places where we've done a lot of work over 20 years, really, and very poor in others. I want to acknowledge that up front. If we're looking at trying to understand the changes that have taken place, there have been huge steps forward in certain countries and competition regimes and in certain regional bodies. So there are competition authorities that have really punched above their weight, that have really made impact, that are beginning to build a case precedent, take on cartels, address abuse of dominance and mergers. There's another set of countries, and I'm putting into kind of loose categories, but it's difficult to, some countries will be on the borders between categories and in different places, depending on different areas of enforcement. There are some countries which are really starting to step up, that are, you can see that they're path breaking, in terms of the changes that have taken place in the last 5 to 10 years. And then there's a large number of countries where there may be a law in place, but there's no institution or there's no law that's been passed. And it's important, I think, to acknowledge that in almost half of the countries in the continent, that is the situation. So there's a lack of enforcement in very, very large parts of the continent. Now, that has a number of implications that we can talk about. One is about how do we support this in practice as a community. Secondly, those countries can be covered by competition law at the regional or the continental level. So there's a really important opportunity in terms of the regional and continental bodies that are in existence, are being developed, and this is a huge, huge challenge. But those have not really delivered yet, with the exception, I think, of COMESA in particular, and some very positive developments in others. So we have a tendency, I think, as authorities and as this community to have somewhat rose-tinted spectacles when we talk about positive developments. But if we're thinking about actual enforcement, how many cartels that we know exist, many standard products, have been tackled when we're talking about regimes in Africa? It's very few. It's in very few parts of the continent that has actually been tackled. And the challenge of tackling these cartels, I'm just picking on this as perhaps the most obvious area of impact, is becoming much more difficult because the companies who are colluding are able to use digital methods. I mean, I was last week or so talking with an authority doing an inquiry, and they said, well, and we actually had an interview, and it's all on WhatsApp. So you should get those WhatsApp messages. And they said, well, this is going to be very difficult. They're disappearing messages, etc. So this is the kind of practical challenges that we need to be looking at. So let me stop there to recognize this huge diversity, really positive steps that we can build on, but we have to have, I think, an honest reflection on where the majority of countries are, in a large proportion of the countries in the continent, which is needing to think about building these institutions and what should we do there.
Thank you very much, Francis Kariuki, for additional comments on the African development.
Thank you, Frédéric, and I thank Simon for giving that sky blue conspectus of what is happening in Africa. And to be specific, is that over the last 10 years, much has happened. What I miss in terms of building the capacity, the regulatory capacity. There has been continued promulgation of competition laws. If we go back to 1990, it's only 2% of the African countries which had laws. That was South Africa, Kenya, and Gabon. Then come the year 2021, is that according to the latest research done by Vela Kigwiro, is that you realize 76% of the African countries have competition laws. And that is at national competition levels. But as Simon has indicated, is that yes, the laws are there. What about how many competition agencies are functional and operational? And when I mean operational and functional, it is an agency which has a law, and also it's receiving cases. You'll find that it's only out of those 41 countries which have laws, it's only 25 which are operational and functional out of 54 countries. So there's an issue of implementation. That is at national competition and national levels. Then when we go to the regional economic communities, which also have been promulgated over the last 10 years, we have COMESA. COMESA Competition Commission is that we have seen it grow, but is that over the last 7-8 years, it has been focusing more on mergers and acquisitions. Over the last 1 year, this is where we have seen it expanding its beacons of enforcement to other areas, like, for example, consumer protection and other restrictive trade practices. But the other regional economic communities, East African Community Authority, is that it has a law. But unfortunately, that law has not been operationalized yet, but the agency has been there since 2006. But there are indications that it might be operationalized come January 2024. When we go to West Africa, we have WAEMU and CIMAC. At regional level is that we are seeing a lot of visibility of regional economic communities. But unfortunately, at national competition agencies is that we don't see a lot of visibility. And I think that is an area where we need to do more research, where you see the French-speaking countries is that regional economic communities are more visible than the national competition agencies. Having said that, is that there is also positive development in terms of budgetary allocation. According to a study done by the World Bank in 2016, is that we have seen that the budgetary allocation has increased by about 39%. I think it's a question that also we need to evaluate in terms of the increase in budgetary allocation, whether it has come with increased implementation. And also, obviously, we have seen the visibility of the African competition agencies in the international arena at OECD and also in the development of ICN outputs. So there's quite positive. In terms of also enforcement, is that I've seen in countries where the expansion of the enforcement spheres from the mergers, when you see Kenya Competition Authority, it started with mergers, it has moved to cartels. 2 months ago, it pronounced itself having broken a cartel case in the steel industry within 10 years of its enforcement. And we have seen South Africa tackling, the novelty areas, if I may call them, of the digital economy. So you can see that there's expansion of moving from mergers to cartels and now moving to the novel areas. Then also is that in terms of what I may call the capacity of the laws, we have seen demand to increase the scope of the laws. We have seen Kenya having started abuse of buyer power provisions, which also was adopted by South Africa to ensure that there is sustainability of SMEs in the retail sector. Then also we have seen the African Continental Free Trade Area coming up with Article 11, which is focusing on economic dependence and gatekeeping. And the national competition agencies are supposed to cascade this to their laws. And lastly is that we have seen a lot of cooperation, especially on informal and formal forums like the African Competition Forum, which has been doing a lot of research in new areas. I know it's focusing on digital right now, and it has done a lot of research on sugar, cement, and the sugar, cement, and also poultry. And moving forward, I'm interested to see, because there has been change of leadership under the African Competition Forum. Now it's being headed by Mauritius and the Cape Verde and the Gambia. We would like to see whether this momentum of research will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francis, for this. So we have seen a complex scene in Africa where there is, as Simon said, a lot of heterogeneity in the development, but with really interesting developments in some countries. And clearly a regional component, which is more or less developed, depending on which regional institution we talk about, but which is kind of the tendency to structure the development of competition law and policy. So let me turn now to Mario Umaña and to Latin America to see whether there are similarities or what the differences are. Mario.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the OECD for the opportunity to talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, if I may. Also, competition policy and developments in competition policy. And before I get into trouble, first let me say that my remarks are strictly personal views and not necessarily represent the views of the Inter-American Development Bank. So before I speak a little bit about the developments in the last 10 years, let me take a step back and talk about the difficulties in this global and regional relationship, because it is complex. In the trade area, for sure, perhaps it's a little bit more clear because we know what has happened in the 20th century, from regional to global with the GATT, WTO, and then back to regional nowadays. In the competition area, the relationship is less clear First, because there hasn't been a global antitrust platform, if you will, despite some efforts in the past under the WTO to have a global agreement. But also because there's some dominant, what I call dominant originating jurisdictions, namely the US and Europe. But there's a lot of heterogeneity inside the regions themselves. Regional integration of sub-regional integration in Latin America is not also a clear picture. The four main blocks have various levels of integration, and competition policy within those blocks has not developed really much. So having said that, we also have to acknowledge the same thing we heard from Africa, that the region is very diverse. Latin America and the Caribbean, what I call LAC, is truly a sociological construct based on some historical commonalities and geography, but it's very far from being a homogeneous bloc, not only because of the many cultures that are involved, but also in terms of economic development. You have countries like the Bahamas with a GDP per capita above $30,000, and countries like Haiti with a GDP per capita with less than $1,000. So Latin America and the Caribbean is the region in the world with the highest inequality rates. So that also has some implications in terms of competition policy. And then finally, there are countries that follow the civil law tradition in the continent mostly, and those that follow common law mostly in the Caribbean. So also there's a second consideration that has to do with culture, but also with religion. And most of the region was traditionally Catholic, and as we know, capitalism and market ideas have developed originally in countries that were not Catholic, and Catholicism, at least in general, put an emphasis in common good. I found a statement, just to give an example, from the Catholic Conference of Bishops of England and Wales, where they say that the Catholic doctrine is incompatible with unlimited free market and laissez-faire, and which insists that the distribution of wealth must occur entirely according to the dictates of market forces. So very, very strong feelings there. Now, having said that, Latin America still Catholic in the majority, but it's dropping. So what it used to be 85, 95, 90, 95%, now is 60% Catholics right now. And so that is changing. So I'm not sure if we can make an absolute link there, but certainly to explain that some in the culture, there are some views that perhaps were at least temporary barriers to understand the benefits of competition. Now, there's asymmetries in the region with regard to the development. So three countries, what I call the trident, Mexico, Brazil, and Chile, are substantially ahead of the others with respect to competition development. And let's say that a few others that are somewhere close or like in a second tier in terms of development, Colombia and Peru perhaps are among those. In terms of legal borrowings, just to be sure, all Latin America and Caribbean antitrust is borrowed. So that's not the question. The question is, what is the adaptation in each of the subregions to the values that came with antitrust, as suggested by my friend Julian Peña in a recent excellent article. So in the case of Latin America, most of the legal borrowing have come from the jurisprudence from the Supreme Court of the United States, rather than from the agencies, the DOJ or the FTC. And it came from the Supreme Court jurisprudence in the years that the court has been more under the influence of the Chicago School, perhaps in the 90s, 80s and 90s, where most of the legislation in Latin America came into existence. So for the most part, most of the agencies are following, let's say, a classic economic analysis based on price theory. In regard to the EU, there's some borrowing with regard to the approach towards unilateral conduct, or what is called abuse of dominance. But the more clear relationship between the region and Europe has to do with administrative law, because as you know, with an exception of Chile, most of them follow, the derecho administrativo sancionador, administrative law, to apply competition policy. So in the last decade, I would say there has been a consolidation for sure in the majority of countries, so very few exceptions. So we're now seeing in the last few years, let's say a second or third wave of legislation, which is good, in countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago, and Costa Rica, for instance, with some second or third generation level of legislation. On the other hand, not much development in countries like Guatemala, Belize, Suriname, and in the Caribbean, only 4 of the 14 CSME members have enacted legislation. So very asymmetric developments. From the enforcement point of view, the story is a bit different because most of the cases have been the same, perhaps like in Africa, in the horizontal area, so both cartels and bid rigging. At the time where leniency, for instance, and we're going to discuss leniency this afternoon, but leniency programs are relatively unused, and the cases of leniency have been dropping. The agency seems to remain cautious in terms of cases of abuse of dominance and vertical agreements, and that may be because the lack of enough staffing in the economic area, and very few agencies have chief economists. So I will finish with the fact that even with those limitations, there are some countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, for instance, that are moving ahead in new areas like digital markets, and we have developments in Brazil by CAGE or COFECE that had established a digital market unit to monitor such development. So this is the complicated puzzle chair of Latin America in the last few years.
Thank you very much. You referred to Julian Peña, who is with us in a second, so I'm going to give him, for a very short intervention, a compliment to what Mario has said. Julian Peña has written a very good article on Latin America. 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Fred. Based on what Mario said, which described very well the situation in Latin America, I want to point out perhaps why Chile, Mexico, and Brazil are in the forefront of the development in Latin America. First, they have a longer tradition of antitrust enforcement. They have laws that date back many decades ago, and that has helped build a bigger antitrust community, which human capital, I think, is crucial for the development of competition law in the region. Second, they have adopted their legislations to their economic, legal, institutional, and political culture, each in a different way. And this is very relevant because I think, as I say in the paper that Fred mentioned before, it is a crucial element for the development of competition law in the region. These reforms were self-motivated. They served as an internal need. They were based on an open debate with the society, and for that, having a longer tradition helped. They were based on their own experience, and third, they instead of copying international models, they were inspired on international best practices. So basically, that's why I think that Mexico, Chile, and Brazil are at the forefront of competition law development in Latin America. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's turn to Southeast Asia. Now I'm going to give the floor to Angayar, Kanni, Ramaiah. You have to push the, yeah.
All right. First of all, thank you, Chair. It's Frédéric. And then thank you to OECD for inviting me to present on the development on the ASEAN progress on competition law. All right. I would like to discuss the progress in ASEAN under two phases, actually. All right. Basically, the first one is from 2007 to 2015, when we had the deadline of all the ASEAN members to have in place a competition law policy. All right. So in that phase, and the second phase is, of course, 2016 to post-COVID, they revised to 2025, okay, that under the new ASEAN Economic Community Policy, okay. Basically, the catalyst for the ASEAN competition law is basically is the AEC, or ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, which also based on this two phase. All right, under the two phase, we had basically introduced two level of we had introduced two guidelines, basically ASEAN Regional Guidelines on Competition Policy 2010 and ASEAN Regional Guidelines on Policy 2020. Okay, all right. On the first phase, okay, the emphasis was, of course, based on the international best practice to introduce, implement, and develop competition policy under specific legal economic context of each ASEAN member state. So there was a implementation, but it was based on the ASEAN way. So that was had a lot of impact and effect and influence on how they introduce. All right. So under that phase, I would say, is it successful? It's questionable. It's arguable. All right. But end of the day, it was basically introduced. All right. In the deadline of 2015, of course, it was not so successful as planned. But end of the day, all right, the first phase, all the ASEAN member nations actually introduced. Cambodia, the last one, and still a very mystery country when it comes to implementation. When it comes to whether functional, operational, and how far the implementation is effective is rather arguable and questionable. All right. But however, on the positive note, all right, they had come up with various other endorsements and also agencies to help to further build on this particular competition law policy in ASEAN with regards to, for example, like they had endorsed the ASEAN Expert Group on Competition, which, worked on building up on the capacity building and various other programs, which was actively taken. All right. So besides that, all right, so we have also other success, like, for example, with regards to implementation wise, all right, awareness, okay, particularly in the initial stage, then cases were more on anti-competitive cases were more on cartel, especially involving small and medium industries. So that part had actually improved in the sense that awareness, okay, among the local business, especially the SMEs, all right, rather improved, and capacity building of the National Competition Agency was prioritized by the ASEAN and also the national at the national level by the government. And of course, there was a lot of work was prioritized by the ASEAN member nations with collaboration with UNCTAD, OECD to improve further as an institution. All right. Okay. On this another thing to mention with regard to first phase is the first phase, because of the, as I say, is the ASEAN way. All right. And when we're talking about best practice or approach, globalized approach, as the speaker earlier, Mr. Mario, said, okay, when we come to best practice and globalize, of course, there is no one standard. Of course, in ASEAN, it was more towards the European Union model. And what happened is when it was adopted, we had 10 different versions of competition law, each having different exceptions, and molded more towards approaching regards regional as well as national, taking into account the local sectors, local champions, and also very much influenced by state-owned organizations, SOEs, okay, which had lots of exemption, which was increasing. Okay, other than that, will be on the second stage, of course, when the new regulation guideline came, there was an additional word there. Earlier was policy, and this time is policy law, which emphasized more on trying to harmonize and trying to meet up with the global standards, because they were moving towards integration, and we want to actually, as a bloc, economic bloc, compete at the global level. So with that respect, I would say we have achieved, but yet there's so much work to be done with respect to trying to improve on the function and operational to be more effective competition agency. And of course, they're very much influenced by the government of the day and the political economy, because most of the competition commissions are independent, but at the same time, they were also under the government instructions, especially when it comes to appeal, and then those matters also influenced on the development. I think I'm time out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I would like to thank the OECD for the opportunity to speak. And I was asked to also cover Southeast Asia, but I took the liberty, with Fred's permission, to reinterpret my remit to expand to cover Japan and Korea as well. And I'm not an expert on all these jurisdictions. I will focus on Korea, Japan, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines as illustration. But if I say anything wrong, and the authority officials here, please correct me. And so I guess the purpose of this panel is to illustrate similarities and differences between regions outside of the US and EU with the US and EU. And I think among the countries that I looked at, there are similarities and differences. Digital economy is a hot issue in particular in Japan and Korea. But there are also some cases that have illustrated, I guess, issues that are more particular to individual jurisdictions, but I think nonetheless would be of interest to developing jurisdictions. I think that enforcement difficulties encountered by some of the Southeast Asian authorities would also be of interest to developing jurisdictions. So in terms of recent developments, there has been focus on digital economy in Korea and to a lesser extent Japan. And the enforcement action in many ways would be familiar to a lot of you who have followed developments in the EU and the US. The KFTC has brought action against Google for the anti-fragmentation agreements or the fork agreements, which of course is also the focus of the EU decision. And we also see self-preferencing in Korea, although not by Google in this instance, but by a local national, I guess, digital economy giants, Kakao Mobility, and was alleged to have, and it offers basically an their version of Uber, and Kakao was accused of preferring its own taxis. And so there's the self-preferencing that we're all familiar with, that has been the focus of EU enforcement action. And but there are also enforcement tools that are probably not as familiar to those of you outside of the region. And for example, in Japan, the JFTC accepted commitments by Amazon over its conduct in basically forcing the merchants to pay for discounts that Amazon imposed across the board. And under the abuse of superior bargaining position provision in Japanese competition law, which is not unique to Japan, Korea also has it. And in Europe, of course, we also have jurisdictions with laws on economic dependency. But I guess Japan is known for a focus on this area. And then, so we have these cases on digital economy issues, some of them familiar, some of them, at least I guess the tool that is deployed less so, but we also have developments in Thailand and Indonesia and Philippines that I think illustrate the, I guess, somewhat unique local circumstances, but also the difficulties faced by developing jurisdictions. For example, I believe Kanni is going to cover a merger between, well, basically an acquisition by Grab of Uber's operation in Southeast Asia. And I think it is fair to say that the authorities in the region were somewhat ambushed by that. And the Philippine Competition Commission, was unable to stop the merger, and in the end had to resort to imposing orders to limit price increases after the merger. And Grab apparently failed to comply with that. And so the Philippine Competition Commission ordered Grab to refund consumers for overcharging. And so that illustrates, I guess, a difficulty that smaller jurisdictions have in enforcing against multinational mergers. And other somewhat more unique circumstance facing Indonesia is the lack of dawn rate powers under the Indonesian competition law. The KPPU does not have the power to conduct dawn rates. And so what that means is circumstantial evidence improving the existence of a cartel agreements becomes a lot more important. And so early this year, the KPPU adopted bid rigging guidelines, which expressly address the importance of the use of circumstantial evidence improving cartel agreements with reference to work products by the OECD. And so I guess not many jurisdictions, authorities lack dawn rate powers. And so in this instance, we see Indonesia's authority having to adapt because of that limitation. And finally, in the case of Thailand, we have seen two mergers where the Thai competition, the TCCT, the Thai Competition Authority, and the telecommunications regulator, according to, it depends on your views. For those who believe that enforcement was appropriate in those instances, the two authorities were accused of not intervening in two obviously anti-competitive mergers. And so I guess you can argue that there was a lack of commitment. And I assume a lot of you are familiar, the Thai regime has seen a lot of difficulties in getting up to speed. And I think these two mergers again show that perhaps the level of commitment by the authorities and maybe by the governments is still not where one would like it to be. So those are recent developments, and I would end here.
Thank you very much. And let's turn to Angela for China.
Oh, thanks, Frédéric, for Thanks, Frédéric, for inviting me. And it's my first time to the OECD. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'll give an overview of what's happening in China in the past decades from three aspects, from law, institutions, and enforcement. So China started to have its anti-monopoly law since 2007, and it was effective since 2008. So we have about 15 years enforcement history. And last year is the first time China amended its anti-monopoly law, and it significantly increased the fines
for potential violations, and also significantly increase the discretion for enforcers in merger reviews, as well as in imposing fines and sanctions. And lastly, the new law also put more emphasis on competition issues in the digital economy. It partly also reflects the changing economic landscape in China, where China now is a big digital power. And it's the only country besides the United States that have so far been able to foster tech giants. And the Chinese digital economy has been quite concentrated, and actually very concentrated. So it's not surprising. We also have more, you can see the new law will be more targeted at large digital platforms. And from the perspective of the institutions, when China first started to enforce its competition law, we used to have 3 antitrust agencies. These are the NDRC, the SAIC, and MOFCOM. And this kind of tripartite form of enforcement did give rise to a lot of problems in coordination, in competition among these agencies as well. And above all is partly because some of the agencies that were delegated to enforce the law, they have other regulatory functions, because when we talk about competition agency, they are just as a small bureau housed within a very large central ministry that kind of work like a conglomerate. They have many other regulatory functions. And to give an example, the NDRC used to be the State Planning Commission and is in charge of industrial policy and formulation of the broader state policy. So some of these regulatory functions also conflict sometimes with competition policy objectives. The previous arrangement of the institutional setting of the Chinese antitrust enforcement wasn't very ideal. And in 2018, Chinese government conducted a significant overhaul of its government, and it created a new agency called the SAMR, the State Administration for Market Regulation. And then these agencies absorb the regulatory functions from the previous 3 antitrust authorities, but it's primarily housed within SAIC, which is traditionally a market regulator. And I see this as a very promising step forward for China to professionalize its antitrust enforcement, because SAIC is an agency that has traditionally been in charge of enforcing anti-unfair competition laws, trademark law, some of the other IP issues. They have a lot of experience in law enforcement. I definitely see this new institutional setting where we now have one single agency which have more experience in law enforcement will be good for the Chinese antitrust enforcement in the years to come. In terms of enforcement, when we look at the Chinese enforcement record in the past 15 years, we see for the most part, especially before 2020, most of the cases involve foreign multinational companies, both in mergers and some of the largest cases, most of the largest cases also involve foreign multinational companies. So far, China have blocked only 3 mergers and imposed conditional conditions in some of the large transactions between multinational companies. But the enforcement against the state-owned firms have been relatively few. And also for institutional reasons as well, because these antitrust agencies, technically the bureaucratic status is quite low, and it's hard for them to tackle very large, powerful state-owned firms. But since 2020, we witnessed a sweeping crackdown in the Chinese digital economy, and China imposed record fines on Alibaba and Meituan. In Alibaba case, it was a $2.8 billion fine. And so it's the first time you see China got very serious with its own domestic companies in the digital platform, because before that, the enforcement was very lax. China also tightened enforcement in the merger realm, so vetted a lot of the merger transactions that previously were not properly notified to the agencies, and now it's going to increase and tighten merger reviews for in the digital economy, including potentially intervening in those so-called killer acquisitions. I think my time is running out, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. So we see indeed similarities and changes. I mean, first, I noted that the regional dimension is quite important in Africa and in the ASEAN context, where there was kind of initiative at the level of the region to try to push the competition law. The heterogeneity is something that we have noted in all regions, except, of course, China, where there seem to be two tiers. I mean, there seem to be competition authorities who are fully developed, and then a lot of other competition authorities struggling at the institutional level to try to reach the level of strong competition authority. When it comes to enforcement, we have a very mixed bag, but generally, maybe a lack of enforcement, if one had to generalize. I mean, from what I think has been said, a particular emphasis maybe in Southeast Asia on exemptions for local interests, whether those are state-owned enterprises or maybe SMEs in a number of regions, and a distinctive style, I would say, in China, where clearly competition policy is a very active policy by the government and is pushed for a purpose. We're going to come back to what are the purposes of and the goals of the competition law. So that's I mean, very broadly, the impression I got from those presentations. So I'd like to move to a second question, which is to what extent the role and usefulness of competition has progressed or regressed in the minds of policymakers and in the mind of the general public. In other words, has there been the development of a competition culture which has gone with those elements, or is competition still a highly technical thing which is for specialists but not really of great interest to the general public? So let me start again by Africa, but I'm going to give the floor to Francis Kariuki first.
Thank you, Frédéric. And from where I sit is that the situation is befogged. There's no clear position in regard to your question, because what is happening on the ground, it's quite a dichotomy. Why do I say that? Is that one is my intervention earlier showed progressive promulgation of competition laws. So you can see is that it seems the policymakers are appreciating the usefulness of the role of competition law. Secondly, is that I've seen all the regional economic community treaties is that they have articles on the need to have competition laws, also supported by competition agencies when they are negotiating for these trade agreements. So it shows that there's positive thinking and appreciation of the role of competition policy. And not also to mention that the laws which have been promulgated is that they capture the basic fundamentals of competition law, so they are modern laws. So there's appreciation. Unfortunately, is that on the other hand, is that you can see some laws have been degraded. When you look at Ethiopia, which some years back was an autonomous agency, is that there has been some changes now. It's a department within the ministry. And number two also is that when you look at a law which was developed in Rwanda, it's too expansive in terms of what it captures, that even the implementation becomes difficult because it deals with the phytosanitary issues and other standards which are not within the cooperation agency. Then also you look at Uganda, the bill which is awaiting assent. The implementability will be difficult because there's no institution. So that is why I'm saying it's more of a dichotomy. And when I come to Kenya, I'll give an example and I'll leave the plenary to decide. Sometimes back, the government was having challenges in the cost of living, and the government said that there's a cartel in the edible oil industry. Instead of calling upon the CAK, that is the Competition Authority of Kenya, to investigate the cartel, the minister said that they are going to import the edible oil into Kenya. And they imported. And when they imported, the manufacturers of the edible oils reduced the cost of edible oils and increased the cost of the bar soaps, which is an end product of the edible oils. And then the government is now stuck with edible oil, which it cannot offload in the market. So this kind of dichotomy is that you really know whether the policymakers or the public really appreciate the role of competition policy over the years. But also is that we have to have in mind that the governments in this part of the world, they are undergoing very serious macroeconomic challenges, that the government is just focusing on macro, and they have not highlighted the interface between the micro, that is how markets can be able to solve the challenges at macro level. So that kind of knowledge is the one which has really caused some confusion. And that is why I'm saying the whole situation is befogged.
Thank you very much. Simon?
Thanks. I want to pick up from this with a couple of examples as well to demonstrate why the rhetoric of competition and regional integration is there. And so we look like the understanding of competition has progressed. But when we look on the ground at what's actually happening, it's not that there's necessarily been regression, but it certainly isn't advancing at anywhere like the pace that we needed to do. I'm going to talk more also about food and agricultural markets to give an example. And this is something that matters both for populations in the regions we're talking about, but actually I'm going to make the case it matters for the world as a whole. When we look at Africa as a whole, we see net food imports, and we see growing demand with urbanization, rapidly growing demand with urbanization happening across the continent. But we have 60% of all the available arable land that could be utilized, that's not being utilized. This is without substantial deforestation, which is also in Africa. So markets are working really badly. You have got the resources to grow agriculture, to meet this food demand, and you have a continent which is a net food importer with very, very high food prices, putting enormous pressures, social pressures on the societies in those countries. This is not recognized as a competition issue generally. The food systems debates are happening where these facts are put out there in the context of climate change, rarely mention concentration and competition. When you look at those markets, you find they're highly concentrated. You find that the productivity of agriculture in those countries is related to fertilizer. This is a regional and an international issue where we find the calls for addressing fertilizer cartels, which are often based in high-income countries. Those calls to address those cartels, which have been made in these forums, they're not being addressed. They're not being taken forwards. But within the continent, within East and Southern Africa, even between countries with enormous potential to increase production and areas where there's food scarcity, across borders, we see cartels or high levels of concentration that are not being addressed. So this is a really crucial issue. When we see in the context of climate change, it becoming even more imperative to address this. So when the Horn of Africa and East Africa had a drought, so you had incredibly high food prices, there's very good rains in parts of Tanzania, Zambia, etc. These are markets which are cross-border within regional integration areas, and they're all about concentration and competition. Of course, there's lots of policy issues, but as we know, non-tariff barriers are often adopted because of the lobbying of the companies that are operating in those countries. This is not a separate issue. These non-tariff barriers and restrictions are not a separate set of issues from the competition issues. So it's really essential that we start to go, in a sense, back to basics on the competition and regional integration question, and work out how we can build these regional regimes to be effective to deal with these questions. Or as Francis said, we'll see governments stepping in and they making kind of knee-jerk responses which don't necessarily tend to work out very well.
Thank you very much. One word, Simon, one word on the perception by the general public. I mean, we've talked about the kind of the lack of perception by governments of what they could do with competition policy, but is the idea that competition is a good thing? Is that developing, or is competition seen as a threatening at a cultural level in many countries in Africa?
So I think there's been a lot of progress in some countries in terms of the general population's understanding of why competition delivers good outcomes to them. When it comes to a merger or an issue about data prices or food prices, what there isn't is any real progress on how this is actually about international or cross-border arrangements. So you can have lots of national enforcement taking place, and saw this during COVID as well, responding to these issues. And countries that have got authorities have taken important steps to show the way there. But that hasn't been part of really tangible steps in terms of the competition regional integration issues. And, you know, the history of Africa means that there are borders in places which don't really make economic sense, right? Which means you need more cross-border enforcement because there happens to be a border there where you wouldn't see that if you were looking at, you know, North America or Brazil. Or, you know, you would see the good areas for production and the major areas of consumption being within the border and the national. In many parts of Africa, that's a cross-border issue. And I don't see that advance taking place at all.
Thank you very much. Mario?
Thank you, Chair. So in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, progression or regression? And I'm afraid that the answer is not clear either, because on one side, there's more visibility in the last decade, but I would say with few exceptions, there's less understanding at the general public level, and even at the policymakers level in some cases. So let me give some examples. It's not uncommon for both for the general public and the policymakers to think or to see competition policy as a tool to perhaps protect SMEs. General public in general seems to be opposed to monopolies, for sure, monopoly power, especially when it's private. Not so sure when it's public. But very quick, the same public is very quick on demanding price regulation, price controls when inflation raises. So part of this has to do with the ability of the agencies to show on the usefulness or the impact of competition policies, because these studies on impact are rare and expensive. There's a few exceptions. COFECE has developed some great work in this area, showing, you know, the impact of competition regulation to the general public on easy terms and terms that everybody can understand. In the past, even some authorities choose to do even some type of soap operas to explain basic concept of competitions to the public. One thing is for sure, better advocacy is needed, but as we heard, maybe also more enforcement is needed so that the cases themselves can be used to explain, you know, the benefits or the dangers of the absence of competition. So this problem between progress or regression has to do with the confusion of the goals, for sure. market efficiency versus fair competition, SME protection or consumer protection, undetermined legal concept, theoretical schools all over the place, Harvard, Chicago, the new renditions. So to be fair, this is not only happening in Latin America. I mean, even in majority of jurisdictions, I would say there's some sort of confusion. So one thing that got my attention is that the private sector in Latin America is often very skeptical, if not adversarial in some cases. I have spent more time convincing chambers of commerce and trade associations in Latin America and the Caribbean on the benefits of competition than doing the same thing with socialist parties in parliaments in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this may be caused by the fact that in many of these countries, mercantilism still reigns. Public opinion, finally, is dominated by social media. So that is a tough one, because what do you do when people are getting information on everything from social media? So populism is on the rise, and consumers are prompt to learn more on these social media tools that on informed analysis. So it's almost like a depiction of some of the nightmares from Ortega y Gasset, Revolt of the Masses in the 1930s. Is this a case for competition authorities to be more aggressive on social media in a context where many of the agencies don't even have budget for a decent website? Finally, I would say that competition policy needs to be properly mainstream in the overall economic policy, and that's part of the reason that perhaps even policymakers do not see competition in general as a main tool. I think there's some good opportunities to explain better the relationship of competition, for instance, with goals on the social side. Most of the goods and services that the income population with the population with the lower income consume are in non-competitive sectors. On the fiscal side, there's also an opportunity with procurement and competition. And with the private sector, we need to explain better the relationship with competition and productivity. So finally, I would say that lately some jurisdictions have been tested politically. Peru, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and some of them even financially, like Costa Rica. So that speaks to the fact that the understanding is not yet at the level that we would like to be. The antitrust community finally is very active, especially in Argentina, I would say. So this is a sign of hope to change the mindset of both general public and the policymakers.
Thank you very much, Mario, for this not so optimistic assessment. Let me turn to Southeast Asia, to Kanni.
All right. I will discuss on basically 2 points on the part of success part on the competition law policy in ASEAN. Basically, the competition culture has been accepted well, especially among the local business. We don't see any more innocent SMEs being caught for publishing their price fixing and things like that. And then there is more work or collaborative work or cooperation between the competition agencies with the other government sectors, in fact, including even the sector regulators, and then more cooperation between the competition agencies itself in the among the ASEAN member nations. In that sense, they have improved. But the biggest problem with achieving successes, of course, with regards to there are various different regulatory differences, both on substantive and procedure among the ASEAN member nations. And the cases become more complicated because we are not dealing anymore with simple cartel cases, okay? After the case of the merger of the Uber and Grab in Southeast Asia, we realized that we need to deal with more of cross-border cases. All right, and basically one is not cubed, and we are now dealing with AI algorithm to fix prices, and then it became more savvy with regards to more technologies involved, and is the competition commissions equipped enough to investigate? And the recent cases with regards to the post, okay, some nations even had merger regulation, but they were not able to tackle the issue when it comes to the Uber Grab merger cases. In post Uber Grab merger cases, we realized that there was a lot of exclusive agreements, and some of the member states which pursued the action were successful, some was not successful. And now we have an issue of when the cases go to appeal to the court, and then whether the judges are, whether they're knowledgeable enough, whether they are able to see the particular case and decide it based on the competition law perspective from the national, regional. So there are so many issues to deal with, and becomes more complicated. And we find that whether the competition commissions are actually equipped, and then whether they are able to deal the case nationally, because you have to deal the case regionally, because some of these business players are more involved regionally, not just in one state. So there is need to have a lots of cooperation. So basically, we need to deal with trying to find some way to harmonize the application, because it's very complicated. What may be found to be some even cartel cases itself in some member nations, okay, it's decided based on the assessment of whether it's based on effect-based or whether it's rule of reason. So there is so many differences with regards to finding infringement itself. And when it comes to merger, when it comes to procedure, like whether it's a pre-notice or post, so there are so many differences. So you find these, especially these multi platform-based industries who are basically digital giants, and they get away, okay, because there is lots of regulatory gaps, okay, between the ASEAN member nations, which has to be actually resolved, because if you want to handle these cases. On the other hand, with regards to the post-merger, what we learned is from the particular case of the Uber Grab cases, the cooperation between, it reunited the competition law convergence in ASEAN. So the competition law, they find it is critical now to assess the cross-border cartel mergers. So there was more cooperation, and then there is underway the lots of sort of studies to trying to harmonize, but it's going to take time, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas?
Thank you, Chair. So Kanni has already spoken about public attitude towards competition in Southeast Asia, so I think I'll focus on Korea and Japan on this point, and then I will cover all those countries with respect to official attitude towards competition. And I think in Korea and Japan, my contacts in Japan and Korea have both reported an interesting situation in terms of public attitude, which is the public differentiates between different aspects of competition enforcement. For example, in Korea, there is great support for enforcement against chaebols, which are the conglomerates in Korea, which have long been seen as dominating the Korean economy. And there's also great belief in fairness. And so that explains the KFTC's active enforcement on abuse of superior bargaining position. Likewise, in Japan, I was told that there is great appreciation for the importance of enforcement against cartels and bid rigging, perhaps partly because this has been traditionally an area of focus for the JFTC, and again, also on abuse of superior bargaining position. So I guess in both jurisdictions, there is some appreciation for competition, but at the same time, there's also I mean, I don't want to use the word conflation, but at least the expansion of the notion of what competition law is supposed to do beyond what most of us would believe to be the traditional goals of competition to also include fairness. And in terms of official attitude, there is a mixed bag in the region. And so, of course, in Korea, there has long been a recognition of the importance of taking into account competition considerations in government regulation. The chairman of the KFTC is a member of the cabinet, and the KFTC opines on competitive effects of government legislation and regulations. And the Philippines has also followed this path. And in 2020, the Philippine Competition Commission and the National Economic and Development Agency issued a joint memorandum circular asking all central government agencies and local governments to review their regulations for potential anti-competitive effects. So these are definitely positive signs, but there are also instances where there is perhaps a less awareness among officials on the virtues of competition. And for example, in Indonesia, early this year, the Indonesian president actually came out asking TikTok to stop facilitating sales of products on the social media platform because it is seen as taking business away from small and medium-sized enterprises. And so I guess in this instance, it is decided that protection of SMEs trumps greater competition between different avenues. And I've also been told that in Japan, in terms of merger policy, the government takes the view that with a decline in population, the markets are shrinking, and so there's greater need for mergers, for consolidation. And so you can argue that in this instance, there's also perhaps declining awareness about the importance of competition. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Angela?
Yeah, I definitely think that the understanding of the role of competition has progressed among the public and the policymakers in the past decade. And from the public standpoint, enforcement is the best promotion of the public awareness of this law. And China's anti-monopoly law is modeled after the EU law, so it can subject firms to very high penalty, up to 10% of the firm's previous year's revenue. So we are talking about extremely high fine there. So the public, from observing the very active enforcement record of the agencies in the past decade, they definitely appreciate the importance and the usefulness of this law in protecting the interests. However, the public engagement with this law is very low. Unlike the United States, where you have a very active plaintiffs bar and you have class action suits, and in China you don't have those. And even when individuals or companies bring cases in Chinese court, it's extremely hard for them to win any of these cases, and the success has been extremely rare, partly because the burden of proof is very high. Because, as you know, in competition cases, the plaintiffs need to offer some economic evidence to support the claims, and it's very hard for the Chinese plaintiffs to satisfy such burden of proof, even for very large corporations. And Chinese court have been very cautious in applying this law. So, despite the fact that public awareness have increased, the public engagement has been very low, and the enforcement is primarily driven by the state. So it's very state-driven, very centralized approach of enforcement. Now, talking from the perspective of the policymakers, policymakers definitely appreciate this tool. It's a very versatile tool for them. First of all, anti-competition can be viewed as a tool for price regulation, because in the past, China used to be a planned economy. but now the market prices have been liberalized and they can't directly dictate the price. But, you know, in some circumstances, particularly during inflation, you can see, you know, competition authorities will prioritize on enforcement in certain sectors, make sure there won't be price increase. So in a way, it's kind of like a price regulation tool. There's speculation that China have been using the competition law for industrial policy purpose, particularly when you observe some of the mergers, remedies that have been imposed on foreign multinational companies. It appears to have incorporated some non-competition concern, but at the end of the day, it's hard to verify those claims because you know that it's for the most part, you know, the enforcement, it's hard to observe what is exactly the motivating concern. And then another interesting aspect of the Chinese antitrust enforcement is that this is also a tool to achieve, you know, kind of the single market in China, like the EU. You know, obviously China is a unified country, but there's very strong regional competitions. So in the past, the Chinese, you know, the Chinese economy in some way is kind of fragmented because of the regional competition, and the government try to use the competition law to discipline some of the local protectionisms. And you can also see, you know, in Chapter 5 of the China's anti-monopoly law, there is specific provisions devoted to tackle so-called administrative monopolies. And lastly is the interesting development since 2018 when the United States started to launch a trade war against China. And then we see rounds of very harsh sanctions on Chinese firms, as well as export restrictions. And we started to see China appears to be using its competition law as a trade tool, as a measure, a countermeasure against a very aggressive foreign sanctions, particularly in strategic sectors like semiconductors, telecommunications. You see China have, you know, been very focused in vetting mergers in those areas. And in some of the cases, they never block any case, but there's been speculation that in some of the cases, China strategically held up some of the transactions. And eventually party have to, you know, those transactions, you know, never go through and they go away because the parties failed to obtain China's clearance. You know, the most recent case is the Intel's acquisition of Tower, and some of the earlier cases like you know, Qualcomm's acquisition of NXP. I mean, these very large budget transactions, they unfortunately seems to fail to achieve China's clearance despite getting approval from other jurisdictions. So let me stop here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to compare the perceptions in the different regions. One get the impression that if I put China on the side for a minute, that in the other region, there has been what I would call a formal or institutional recognition of competition law enforcement and competition institution, but that has not necessarily led to either a full appreciation of how competition law policy and competition law enforcement could be used to the best benefit of the countries, or even to a real understanding of what the goals or lack of confusion on the goals of competition law. And this has been said both by Mario with respect to Latin America and also when we were discussing Southeast Asia. One theme that came back is the insufficiency of the cross-border enforcement, very clear. I mean, this was mentioned for Africa, for example. It was also expressed by Angayar for Southeast Asia. But there, in the case of Southeast Asia, it seems that among the difficulties is the heterogeneity of laws and regulations in different countries that adds a layer of complexity to transnational enforcement. In the case of China, I mean, this is interesting because the centralized nature of the enforcement means that the Chinese government, from what we've been told by Angela, sees competition policy as a very useful tool for a variety of purposes. And she's described at least 3 purposes. One of them is political, in a sense, which is the unification of the country. Another one is political in the sense that, but it's more as a tool in international trade, really, and to answer the tensions that are at the strategic level between China and other country. And the third one is to keep in check inflation, so very focused on prices and trying to avoid prices. Now, those are not necessarily the typical use that one would think, at least outside of China, for competition law. But so we come to the idea that in many countries, competition law is either underused because it's not fully understood, or because the goals are a bit conflicted, or used in strategic ways, which is not exactly what one hope for. And second, that at the international level, where there is a need for cooperation, a need for enforcement, the heterogeneity of the competition law and the legal systems is really standing in the way. So to finish this, I want to conflate the next 2 questions and have a last round of, so the 2 questions are, what are the hot topics and what are the challenges? And I've decided that maybe the hot topics are very closely related to the challenges, and maybe we can have just a round of discussion on this. So I will start again, I mean, by giving the floor to Simon for Africa to tell us about what are the hot topics and what are the main challenges that you see. Doesn't mean that you'll have twice as much time. I mean,
not twice as much, maybe, but I was very brief in the last round. We've coordinated a little bit as well on this between Francis and myself. So to build on what we've just been discussing and say, how do we go forwards? I guess hot topics and challenges also taking us to looking forward. And while I said that the understanding of competition is not progressing as we would hope, particularly with regard to regional competition challenges, I think the natural comeback would be, well, are you surprised? I mean, these are not things which resonate easily with populations where there's often a tendency to look, closer to home. Governments want to look for a lever they can pull really quickly to be able to act. And those are very valid and important points, and they push us to think about how to address those challenges. It's also, notwithstanding the very good work that national authorities have been doing and regional bodies such as COMESA have been doing. But I do think then it poses the kind of questions to us in terms of, well, how do we demonstrate those effects? And particularly, how do we demonstrate those effects in the context of the issues of industrial development, of economic development challenges, which were raised in the opening panel, which is obviously very critical for African countries, and in the context of what has been grouped roughly as a kind of public interest issues, equity, inclusion types of issues. Because if we don't demonstrate the effects and relate them to these wider development challenges, then we're not going to advance the agenda around building the institutions. The institutions won't get the support they need, they won't get the resources they need, they won't get the political buy-in and cover that they need. And when we think about that in terms of building institutions, I think we should be thinking very much about the kind of practical steps that are required for effective enforcement. Now, we're going to see this playing out in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area Competition Protocol. It's been adopted, and now it needs to be ratified. And that ratification will depend on demonstrating the effects and saying this institution, working together with national competition authorities and regional bodies, will be able to do things that matter. right? And so I think that's where we are right now in the context of these challenges in the African continent. And so we'll be able to track this ratification, and in that ratification, we'd say, how was this explained to the parliaments in the different countries in terms of what this institution and these arrangements are going to deliver? And this is a debate which I think has not had nearly enough attention, with some notable exceptions in terms of academics. The Kagwira has written very effectively about the need to focus on these institutional arrangements, for example, but there's very little attention, I think, being placed on this. In the protocol, and if we look at the protocol and the issues there, there's some very obvious areas, mergers and cartels. And I would want to argue that if you don't address horizontal mergers and cartels, then we really won't get to the starting line. But there's also digital and public interest. This is where there's a lot of debate happening. I would say you have to get to the starting line in mergers and cartels to get the ability to bring in the wider issues around digital and public interest that are there in the protocol. I think there is a case to be said, well, Africa as a continent can speak on digital platforms if they adopt it in the AFCFTA, but economists will talk about opportunity cost. If we spend our time focusing on this, we will be taking away the time and energy that needs to be spent on how are we going to block this horizontal merger, which is going to raise prices for basic commodities across the continent. And I think that we have to really think about the prioritization of energy that goes into, and resources and time that goes into these different questions. We've also got to think about what practical cooperation means. We have had enormous amounts of platforms discussing. I think sometimes the staff of authorities hardly spend any time in the office because they're going to spend so many meetings talking about cooperation. And yet, when you actually talk to people about the cooperation that is happening, did you know about that cartel, which this authority raised, which is clearly a cross-border cartel? Just look at the products and the companies. They're traded products, and the companies have got branches all the way across this region. Did you know about that cartel? The answer often is no. This is to the regional body or the body across the border. And this is, we should be putting our hands up and saying, mea culpa, this is not good. This is our fault, right? This is as this community here. And so building practical cooperation, I think, is the other area, along with kind of prioritization of these energies and activities to build these institutions, that I would say are really the hot topics, and also in terms of the big challenges that we need to address.
Thank you, Francis. You want to add anything?
Yeah, sure, Frédéric. And I think we need to appreciate what is informing the hot topics. The COVID-19 ramifications and the current geopolitical tensions, which have distorted the global supply chains, have formed the competition agencies and other countries to start looking inward and regionally to see that they can be able to develop their own capacity to satisfy what was disrupted by COVID-19 and what is being disrupted by the geopolitical tensions which are going on in some parts of the world. The other agenda is Africa Rise agenda. We have to appreciate there's such a populist slogan going on. And all these now, they are leading to what, if I may remember, what the chief economist talked about in regard to industrial policy and the interconnection between cooperation policy. Countries are focusing on building on their own basic industrial policy so that they can support their own economies and the regions. And that is why, because in Africa, we don't have these big industries, there's a lot of what they are talking about protection of small, medium enterprises. So you'll find that the competition enforcement is focusing on that. The other area also, it's in terms of digital economy. In terms of what the digital economy and platforms can support, the connection of the producers, that is the manufacturers in towns, and the disparate consumers across the underdeveloped regions of our countries. And the digital platforms are, they are the umbilical cord of this indispensable infrastructure. So they are positive, but if at all they tip, now those consumers will not be able to achieve that. So there's this where the competition agencies, they are discussing in regard to how they can regulate that. But the challenge is, do they have the capacity in terms of, can they create critical mass to be able to face the gammas? Can they be able to analyze the market definitions and all that challenges? And therefore, that is why you are seeing that they have signed a memorandum of understandings, I think 2, 3, but they have not seen on the ground what they are doing. So there's this issue of having critical mass to be able to deal with the digital platforms. But in terms of the challenges also, is that what I'm seeing is that there's lack of clear competition policies at national levels. Changing in government, it is somehow backtracking progress made in competition law enforcement. I'll give an example of Kenya, where we had competition policy and activities being underpinned within the economic policy of the government. With the subsequent government coming on board, the current government have not seen anywhere competition law or competition policy being mentioned to drive the economic agenda of the country. So, and I think if at all we have, documented competition policy, which transcends across, governments in the African continent, there's something which can be able to support the entrenchment of competition law and policy. At regional level, Simon has mentioned about it. I'm seeing some challenges in terms of, the intercourse between national competition agencies, regional economic communities, and the African Continental Forum, also taking into account that we are talking about the principle of acquis under the treaty, that you don't distort what is in existence. And the other challenge I'm seeing, it's also in terms of domesticating the novel Article 11, economic dependence and gatekeeping to national competition agencies, which even have not matured enough to be able to regulate the traditional markets. So those are the issues I'm seeing.
Thank you very much, Francis. So, Mario, what about Latin America?
Thank you, Chair. So hot topics and challenges. So I would say most of the current problems are on the institutional side. So first, I would say the struggle to protect the technical independence of the agencies and try to shield them from political interference. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the jurisdictions have suffered important challenges. Sometimes I would say the original sin is very much in the way the appointment process was designed in the law. And I recognize independence is a very strong word. Autonomy perhaps is better, especially with respect to the role of the agencies as competition administrative tribunals. But autonomy and independence doesn't mean isolation either. So it also requires good relationship with the executive and the legislative branches, and that's not always happening. The relationship with regulators, I mean, in relationship between competition agencies and regulators is not completely strong, or I would say even clear. A large number of jurisdictions maintain overlapping competences and yet asymmetric capabilities. Regulators tend to be better funded, for sure, and typically have more human resources. In some countries, the protection of the turf may delay further cooperation. Budget constraints, absolutely. Still, many jurisdictions do not have the minimum resources required to do the very basic job. The question here is how to convince the ministers of finance in the context of severe fiscal constraints that most of the countries have. Perhaps the relationship between competition policy and public procurement can offer a door or a window to get the attention of the ministers of finance. On the substantive side, there are issues related to the exceptions in the law. So the need to include all sectors within the realm of competition law is a major issue and challenge. And also to avoid the confusion that I have seen permanently with consumer protection territory. Some jurisdictions, there's a lot of time spent and resources in cases, for instance, of unfair practices, which is not at the core of typical competition arena. And also, we have seen some flexibilization during the pandemic that may be difficult to reverse. So challenge is how to move forward in getting greater support without compromising the core competition principle. I will put an example. There's a very hot topic right now, which is food sovereignty, as we was explained in Africa. So policymakers move from talking from food security now to food sovereignty, meaning food sovereignty to try to make this region completely sovereign, which is very complicated and comes with all sorts of troubles and implications in competition policy as well. So now, aside from the more developed agencies, I think there's a very urgent need to consolidate the next tier. Right now, what I see is that the gap between the first tier and the second tier is only increasing. There has to be more attention to some of the newer topics because some of them are limited to the mature jurisdictions. The integration blocks do not operate as single markets. All the 4 blocks, Mercosur, Andean Community, CARICOM, Central American Common Market, still need substantial overhaul, and especially in terms of competition policy, is very little what they are doing. There's no real cross-border application of competition law in Latin America and the Caribbean, even in the more developed blocks. So need to shield from political interference. Private sector enforcement, maybe. I know Brazil has moved in that direction. So we know the private sector dominates antitrust in the US. In Latin America is very limited. The region, of course, is perhaps more concentrated than most of the other parts of the world. Inequality in Latin America is much higher than in Europe and the US. So this bipolar character of inequality in the region and similarly bipolar character of the distribution of productive units where income is generated. So lots of issue. Let me try to end that. Perhaps the central message is that high inequality in the region is deeply rooted in the productivity problem. So perhaps an alternative venue is to focus less on the structure of the market, because the structure is already very, very concentrated, and more perhaps on how do we use competition policy to increase productivity of SMEs, for instance. That's not an easy issue. I will stop there.
Thank you very much. So let's go to Asia. Kanni?
All right, I'll go with the challenges first. All right, regional challenges, basically, as mentioned again and again, ASEAN is a heterogeneous group of countries with varying different level of economy, all right, and the different goals and incentives for enacting the competition law itself. Okay, therefore, in practice, when it comes to application, they're very much diverted by the constitutional and national economic policy, industrial policy. So sometimes they cannot see eye to eye between the ASEAN member nations itself. Economic and social challenges also affect the market. And so basically here, it is not going to be very helpful. Different state intervention in the same market will require coordination. and consultation to minimize the unintended adverse effect, because one exemption given in one member, okay, the other member, all right, will not have the exemption, is going to have effect. All right, so there will need to be a coordination to the requirement with regards to, they also have to consider the unique position of some of the member nations, like the CLMV nations or underdeveloped, okay, because you can't apply the same standard. And also there is a lots of particular unique policies, especially like Pancasila in Indonesia, the constitution like Article 145 in Malaysia, which certainly blocks the application of trying to apply the competition law generally, okay? And also inconsistent exemption and exclusion policy. There is no specific centralized approach. In fact, it was not actually identified in the regional guidelines, no sunset rules as to how and when to stop. So this increases the sector regulated exemption policy within the competition, causing plurality in competition regulating agency. This undermines the efficiency of the competition agency, especially in essential sectors like aviation, digital technology, telecommunication, causing monopoly and market failure. All right, in the sense that when I say market failure, there is self-interest actions of individuals, the market lead to outcome not in the best interest of the society or the consumer, also leading to corruption, market fail to produce socially optimal quantity because it's a closed market trade, got trade restriction policy. All right, and no specific policy exists to regulate and manage competitive neutrality of the SOE or state-owned, state-linked government sectors. So even though they have a lot of link and significance historically with regards to social political significance, but there is no specific standard, that's also going to cause a problem. And the efficiency of the competition law generally at the national level and regional level. Lack of competition law expertise among judiciary, that is a major problem with regards to, because most of the competition commission cases go to appeal to the court end of the day. So that impacts competition commission independence in most ASEAN member nations, very much under the government direction. Budget is always an issue, insufficient budget to conduct market study, hire experts and train independently. Lack of economists, and now we have lack of computer technology experts to deal with or collect evidence involving digital platform sectors involving complicated algorithm, AI, anti-competitive price cases, digital merger, digital market study involving digital giants. So that is another area which is a big gap that need to deal with. All right, on the hot topics that we need to deal with is with respect to state-owned and state-linked or state-dominated sectors, especially with regards to on the competition transparency to avoid corruption and other market failures. Digital platform mergers and acquisition involving digital giants can reduce competition and increase regions' economic of scale and market dominance. That has to be addressed because there's more coming, okay? Competition law regulated tools are insufficient to regulate and control anti-competitive agreement and collusion involving digital sector, platform sector like ride-hailing apps, food delivery apps, holiday rental apps. All this are using a lot of algorithms and also a lot of collusion affecting the consumer market. We have received a lot of complaints, but of course we don't have the right tools to address it. Gig economy is another area we have to also look into. At the same time, you know, when it comes to gig economy, we do not want to, especially ASEAN nations, very much dependent on the innovative ideas and new technology. But at the same time, you have to balance it because it should not undermine the consumer and the consumer market. SME and MSME competition culture awareness still need to be improved, even though it has improved. Sustainable development, when we have also other issues, the sustainable development goals, and also with food, we need to also regulate, and that also need to look into because it cannot be just held at a national level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas.
Right. So
I think the hot topics that I'm going to focus on from the countries that I surveyed mainly fall within the category of digital economy issues and I guess due process issues. And in Japan, Korea, and Thailand, there has been discussion about what to do with digital economy. And in Korea in particular, the debate is between government regulation and self-regulation. Under the previous administration of President Moon, there was a draft Online Platform Fairness Act that was in Parliament, and which my understanding is would have gone beyond the Digital Markets Act in the EU, but that was not adopted. And with the change of administration, the change of focus is now on self-regulation. But among the Korean academics I've spoken to about this, there was quite a bit of skepticism about the effectiveness of self-regulation. And in Japan, there's also focus on what to do with digital economy, and the debate there has taken on an interesting direction. There is apparently the perception of a dichotomy between competition on the one hand and data security on the other hand. The debate there has been somewhat framed as a choice between greater competition and greater data security. The implication is more competition would result in less data security, and so that is obviously playing into the favor of the big tech companies. And so there's also, I mean, like in Korea, which adopted a law banning prohibiting Google and Apple's ban on third-party payments mechanisms on their app stores. In 2021, there is also attention to this issue. The Japanese government has recently convened a conference on digital market competition, and one of the suggestions is there is a need for regulation on this matter. And even Thailand has contemplated whether DMA-style ex-ante regulation would be necessary for the country. So here we're definitely talking about the Brussels effect as far as the digital ex-ante regulation of digital markets are concerned. And finally, due process issues. I guess this is probably more specific to Korea. There is focus on right of defense and attorney-client privilege, and in particular, my understanding is the American defense attorneys have raised serious objection to the lack of attorney-client privilege as it is practiced in the U.S. in Korea, and that has created some concern among American practitioners. So I think these are the hot topics that have been percolating in the jurisdictions that I looked at.
Thank you very much. Angela?
Yeah, I will be very brief. I think the biggest, also the hot topic, and also the biggest challenge China faces at the moment is how can the country effectively regulate its own big tech firms without undermining investor confidence and innovation. Because since 2020, China initiated sweeping law enforcement campaign against its own tech giants like Alibaba, Tencent, and a bunch of others. But the market sentiments were extremely negative. Altogether, these firms lost over $1 trillion US dollars market capitalization in the past couple of years. If you look at Alibaba stock, the firm is now worth a quarter of what it was at its peak. And if you look at the mainstream media in the West, many speculated that these so-called crackdowns were politically driven, particularly targeted at some of the flamboyant tech entrepreneurs like Jack Ma. But from a standpoint of a competition law specialist, I do see, perfectly legitimate reasons for the Chinese government to go after these companies. As we said earlier, the market is extremely concentrated. The digital market is extremely concentrated in China. You basically have, a duopoly controlled by Alibaba and Tencent. Each of them have hundreds of portfolio companies in different lines of businesses. They erected walled gardens against each other, and it's very hard for new entries to come in. And so, you know, if you look at the cases the government did, you know, those choose one from two exclusivity cases, and those merger cases that they brought, I mean, these are perfectly legitimate, you know, motivated by legitimate competition concern. But the question is, the problem is that, you know, the investor sentiments were extremely fragile for a number of reasons. And so despite, you know, even when we're talking about very high fine, you know, in Alibaba's $2.8 billion fine, but there's nothing compared with the market loss and the reputation damage that they suffer in the market. So since 2022, we see the government now shifted its focus from, you know, tightening regulation in the sphere to restoring investor confidence. So there has been hardly any more cases in this area. And it's been extremely quiet. So kind of like a roller coaster that we have seen, and query when China will get serious again in tackling these companies. And the other concern is, like, you know, whether these competition law enforcement has come too little, too late, because the market structure has already been formed. And, you know, even after this sweeping crackdown, we haven't seen any any new entry into the market. We haven't seen any change of the competition structure. So it relate more or less the same, right? I mean, so query whether China need to introduce ex-ante regulation as what EU is currently doing. But obviously there's a lack of political momentum to push forward that kind of enforcement. I think that's it. Let me stop here. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those insights. It's interesting to see that whether we talk about Africa, where the issue was raised of whether there was enough of a critical mass of cooperation between competition authorities to start tackling issues like the digital sector, or Southeast Asia, where there was also the question of in various countries of how to tackle them, and China. So the digital seems to be across region, across levels of development, across institutional development, a concern everywhere. Not necessarily exactly the same concern, but still a concern. There are some specific issues. Francis talked about the political continuity, or the lack, rather, of political continuity in Africa as being an obstacle to the development, to the harmonious development of competition policy, because there were reversals and stop and go, which is more, I mean, seems to be more important in the African context. The institutional issues seem to be more important in Latin America, and the development, and that goes both to the issue of the minimum budget for competition authority to be able to discharge their duty, but also the increasing gap between the first level and the second level of competition authorities, which is the lack of independence. But in Latin America, for example, what seemed to be very clear is that the very strong inequality, which, by the way, also exists in Africa, but is a major obstacle, in fact, to the development of competition law, which is less an issue probably in Asia, but they're state-owned enterprises or state-linked, whatever the link is, seems to be a major issue for the development of competition and competition law. In all countries, I mean, in all regions, there was a need for more coordination between countries, so that's a common thing. We've already talked about why this coordination was not what it was, because of the heterogeneity of the laws, but it seemed that there was a general view, except put China aside from that, but that there was a need for more cooperation to tackle a number of cross-border issues. And for this, there was a need for a certain amount of convergence between countries that was not sufficient. So I think that this was this view of what were the development, what were the perceptions, what were the challenge was quite interesting. It was not always completely optimistic about the development in the last 20 years. So maybe when we're sitting in a bubble at the OECD in the competition committee and think that the whole world is organized around what we do, maybe this is not entirely true. We have a little time to take questions or comments. I see that I don't know what the banner says, but let's say the Allen Fels banner or whatever that is, would like to have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to pick up one aspect of this complex discussion. Generally, the public support is less for competition and its beneficial economic effects than for competition regulators being seen to stand up against the most powerful private sector businesses in the country, and also for fairness. There's also support for consumer protection, and there's support for doing something about prices. So how can this be harnessed by competition bodies? Well, first, I do think enforcement in regard to big businesses gets support. It also typically involves confrontation, and the media loves a fight, and there will be a lot of publicity and education stemming from actions of that kind. But in regard to the fact that people like more standing up to big business than competition, the kind of challenge is to build off that public feeling, but to lead the discussion onto the competition and economic issues that are of concern to us. Of course, the more consumer protection that can be done, if possible, in an agency, the better. That's always supported. And then on prices, again, it's not a great idea to control prices generally, but there is much to be said for starting with a study of prices and the fact that they may be high, and then taking the discussion into an analysis of the causes of that, which are a lack of competition. So again, to build a competition agenda of pricing and market studies. And the other little point I wanted to mention was also, most of these points have been sort of mentioned in the discussion. Agencies sometimes are convenient places for governments to send issues to. That also gives an opportunity, if used, to build a competition story.
Thank you. There's one dimension, though, added dimension to your first observation that, okay, it can be useful from the point of view of being understood and to develop, to go against big business, particularly because big business may be indeed engaged in anti-competitive transactions or anti-competitive practices. But in many small countries, there's a very close connectivity between big business and the political establishment. So that is not necessarily going to lead the competition authority to get the kind of support that it's hoping to get. And I think that we've seen, I mean, I'm not going to name countries, but I do have a number of countries where that strategy probably would backfire in terms of allowing the competition authority to develop institutionally. But UNCTAD has its flag up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the speakers for very interesting remarks. I just wanted to make a few points. Well, the first one on the benefits of regional cooperation for developing country. As most of you will know, UNCTAD is the voice, or was born as the voice of developing countries in what regards the multilateral trading system. And so, of course, what is currently the World Trade Organization framework plays a very important part when we talk about regionalization. And despite, of course, the WTO having picked up early on the very important intersection between trade and competition, it has a little bit put it on hold. But early this week, as we celebrated on the 5th of December, the 43 years of the United Nations set of principles and rules on competition, it was interesting to hear colleagues from WTO saying that most regional trade agreements, and so far almost around 360 regional trade agreements have been notified to the WTO, include competition provisions. This has previously been discussed some years ago in this forum. And at the same time, WTO trade policy reviews always encompass a competition chapter. And I think this is a very positive development, especially when we talk about developing countries, because clearly from a sector-specific point of view, due to the pandemic outbreak impact, due to the cascading crisis, sectors such as food, energy, and public health are clearly also related and can be dealt with within the broad context of the multilateral trading system, probably highlighting the important connection between international trade and competition. But in any case, for UNCTAD, we have been favoring regional cooperation for developing countries, especially for those who are small, who are young, less experienced, more resource constrained, as ways of pooling resources, of launching joint initiatives, of strengthening capacities. I do agree that in a way, the enthusiasm with regional economic organizations, and let me mention the African continent, which is so vibrant, is a little bit, in a way, worrying, because the very ambitious project of the African Continental Free Trade Area will have to somehow coordinate national, regional, and the continental level. But on the topics, also, I would like to say that what we have been clearly observing is that competition law and policy and competition authorities have been increasingly called to address priorities from a macroeconomic point of view and a social point of view. Clearly, for the last 3 years, since the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, that is interesting because this requires competition authorities to really work closer at national and regional level, and hopefully also at international level. So with consumer protection authorities, with data protection authorities, with all sector-specific regulators. And this is also very clear when we talk about digital markets. And in a way, this increased coordination, hopefully to achieve better coherence in national and regional policies, will serve the purposes that we all share. So I just wanted to mention this, and also to add that in what regards consumers and citizens, I think that despite the efforts of several competition authorities to communicate better, to make a better case, so to speak, or a simpler case of why competition is beneficial also for consumers, for individuals, and for small businesses, there is still work to be done. And while contrary to one of the speaker's comments, I do think that social media can be a very powerful instrument, and we have been observing this across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And I want to add something on regional agreement as a way, or regional organization as a way to promote the agenda of competition. First, I think your starting point is very well taken. By now, there's a clear conscience that if you talk about trade, you also need to talk about competition, because, and therefore, that's the reason why most of the trade agreements now have a competition part. Okay, so that's certainly an evolution over the last 20 years. But then what we heard today on the panel were very different stories about the effectiveness of trade, of regional organization to push the idea of competition. So there may be, I mean, we heard from Mario that in Latin America, in fact, the regional organizations have been very weak in pushing this agenda. I mean, they maybe have been very weak in general, but there's not much integration really that pushes competition. We've heard from Simon and Francis the fact that in Africa, there are extremes. The COMESA has been quite successful as at least a sub-regional level, but if you look at West Africa, then OAMU and ECOWAS haven't been so successful yet. And then there is now the national, the continental level. So how all this is going to work out depends very much on the relationship between the regional and the local level, and we don't know yet how that's going to work. But I wanted to come back to Kanni because what Kanni said, the first phase, which was to push the countries in Southeast, in the ASEAN region to have a competition law. There, the ASEAN seem to have had quite a positive influence and have succeeded in this program. And then the second phase, which is the development of, or the harmonization of those laws, it seems to have evaporated in terms of influence. So why is it? I mean, is it the fact that there hasn't been a continuity of interest at the ASEAN, at the level of the ASEAN organization in the issue of competition? Or is it that the nature of problem, I mean, it was easy to get everybody to have a law, but then after that, it becomes much more difficult to get them to harmonize their views, or was it a reaction against what the ASEAN? So I wanted you to comment a little bit on the fact that we've had those two phases, one quite successful and one where the ASEAN as a force seemed to be much less obvious.
Sure. Yeah. When we're talking about the two phase, of course, the first phase, as I mentioned, the first phase is not like it was like the deadline was 2015. It was not excellently successful in the sense that, as I mentioned, not all the 10 ASEAN nations had put competition law in comprehensive. And I'm talking about competition law, it's not comprehensive because some some nations like Malaysia left out merger, and then and other nations also left out merger. Some took anti-competitive, and of course they limited TD. So it was molded. It was molded to become regional because it was allowed to be ASEAN way. So it became regional. So acceptable because if ASEAN, the central committee had pushed it for more to become a particular standard, as I mentioned again, there's no standard, global standard. The guidelines were more towards the application like in European EU. They took the model there. So it was one way of meeting up the particular score of like making every ASEAN nations to actually adopt and put a particular enact the law, all right, is to allow the ASEAN way to give them the, okay, try to mold it and try to adjust it to each nation's needs. But what happened is when all of them are trying to actually comply with that, the incentive behind enacting the competition law was very different. And going back to Teresa, basically the trade agreements had a lot to do with why they actually enacted the competition law, because some of these nations had trade agreement, and one of the requirements of the trade agreement is you have to put competition law in place. So that was another incentive. Okay, so, and some of the nations already had competition law in place because they had to comply with the trade agreement. And of course, with the 2015, the first phase of implementing, all right, they had to also fulfill the regional requirement, regional obligation. But the good part is none of them backed up or say that, okay, we're going to revise. Everyone, end of the day, fulfilled the requirement of putting in place. Of course, Myanmar was the last one. And of course, and when it comes to application and how efficient it is, I would still say it's arguable. On the second phase, all right, the move was more towards trying to go towards getting the integration, trying to integrate ASEAN as an economic bloc. And here, the fulfillment was more towards trying to fulfill the global standard. So when we're trying to fulfill the global standard, that's where, we had lots of challenges, and the diversity came into the picture in the sense that, oh, we can't fulfill this because I have a constitutional requirement which does not allow this. Indonesia had the Pancasila, and there was so much of diversity, and they're still trying to actually try to build the block. That was the motive behind the 2025 blueprint. And I think that's a positive note in the sense that they're trying. Of course, it's not going to be that easy because of the diversities. But then again, my proposal in my research was actually basically, convergence is something it's rather difficult at this point of time. I don't see, and most of the scholars agreed with that. But harmonization towards convergence. So I would say it's more of, rather than, being a vision, it started with a vision. All right, this vision must move towards a journey in the second phase, and it has to get somewhere. To get somewhere, we have to harmonize, and harmonizing it is basically trying to meet up. And I think that's what ASEAN is actually trying to do. In the recent meeting that they were actually trying to see how, in what areas they can converge, what areas they can harmonize, and what areas, of course, they can't. And you must understand, ASEAN have this non-interference policy, ASEAN way, and it's going to be very difficult. You can't compare it to EU, a centralized approach, but I think they are working towards harmonization, which is going to be tough, but I think they're moving towards, the journey is there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we cannot have there's a question over there. Very last comment or question then. It's a question, yeah. So you have to use the microphone, but you can raise your question, but it's got to be very short because we have to wrap up.
My question is for Thomas, Professor Thomas, and also Associate Professor. Right, you talk about Alibaba's effect and the roller coaster effect when China was balancing between consumer welfare, competition policy, and economic policy. May I know what are the regional cooperations that China took in order to address this impact on Alibaba's and digital market that happens to Alibaba, if I may, both from Prof. Thomas and Prof. Angela.
Would you mind clarifying a little bit? Well, what do you mean the regional effect?
If I may mention that China push the button.
The digital company like Alibaba and in the digital market, and they also then they became quiet, and it's a rather roller coaster action or measures. Can you please enlighten us on the recent or any regional cooperations that China took within the competition policy to address this matter? Thank you.
And that's actually, very simple. I mean, they're very quiet, right? I mean, it's not there's not much going on, and there's a greater emphasis on let's normalize our competition enforcement. As you see, agencies now return back to the routines, and companies now need to enhance the compliance. So it's more of a softer approach of nudging firms to improve compliance, monitor the compliance, rather than taking big stick, going after these firms and imposing a hefty fine. So I think it's a very dramatic shift of a regulatory approach. Query whether, you know, this softening approach will create strong deterrence against anti-competitive practices. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to stop at this point. I really want to thank all experts. I think it's been a very interesting travel throughout the world to see what was the development of the field, what were some of the concerns, to what extent there were similarities, and what some of the differences were. There's still a lot of work to try to get those institutions to actually deliver. I think we've got some ideas about where the priorities lie. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you very much to the experts. Now I have 3 announcements which are going to confuse you. The first one is that you should all have a big smile, because we're going to have a photo on the stairs there. The next 2 are that you should not have